Chapter 251. Training the Boys. Later that day, the rest of the residents of the Shiba house came back along with Isami, who immediately got shocked on seeing the members of Cow's brigade in bandages and immediately got on alert. But before she could do anything, the rest of them immediately stopped her and explained the situation to her, making her stop. She just looked at the bandaged people with a suspicious look, after which all of them went inside to change into more comfortable clothing. Soon after that, Loki came back with a satisfied look on his face and covered in dirt and blood. There were two teenagers along with him whose faces were totally unrecognizable and their bodies covered in blood. I never thought that using magic could give me so much satisfaction. Loki then looked at the two beaten-up teenagers and said, "Know your place, trash." Valley and Chow Chow, who heard that, wanted to attack him, but their bodies didn't even move a bit. Tatsuya, who saw their state, looked at Loki and said, "You did quite a number on them, huh? Anyway, Asia, take care of these two." Asia got up from her seat and walked towards the two of them, grabbed their legs and started dragging them to their room, while a trail of blood was left behind by the corpses she was dragging. Valley and Chow Chow groaned in pain as their injuries were hurting because of being dragged by Asia. Hearing their groan, Asia turned around with a small smile on her face. She tilted her head slightly and said in a sweet voice, "If you both don't want me to bury both of you 6 feet under the ground, then stop that groaning," and then raised her fist and showed it to them. Both Chow Chow and Valley trembled a bit once they heard that, and immediately the male members of the Valley team and Hero faction came and carefully carried the two of them. "Don't worry, Asia-sama, we will take them to their room. You need not bother about this. Just please help us in healing them." Asia just nodded her head with a smile and led them to the room. Once they were gone, Tatsuya cleaned the blood on the floor with his magic and looked at Loki and said, "Go and get treated by her as well, and I am sealing your powers once again." Loki, whose powers were once again sealed by Tatsuya, sighed and said, "Fine," and then went to where Asia and the others were. Tatsuya then got up from his seat as well and decided to check whether Kaneko was fine or not. In another room in Tatsuya's house, Kuroka was looking intently at her sister, who was sitting cross-legged while her body was releasing a white aura which was fluctuating a lot. "Chiron, focus once again. Your aura is getting unstable." Kaneko, who already had a frown on her forehead, furrowed her brows even more, trying to concentrate on stabilizing her aura, and soon the fluctuating aura oozing out from her calmed down a bit. Kuroka, who saw her sister focusing so hard, smiled a bit and decided to help her. She then placed her hand on Kaneko's back and then helped her stabilize her aura. Once the aura was totally stabilized, Kuroka nodded her head and said, "Now spread it evenly in your body and do it slowly. No need to rush at all. Wani-chan is here to help you." Kaneko nodded her head and tried to do just as her sister instructed her. Her cat ears and tails soon came out as well once she started to distribute her aura. Tatsuya, who decided to check on Kaneko, went to her room and knocked on the door, but received no reply in return. He then entered the room without knocking again and was a bit surprised to see Kaneko, whose ears and tails were out, sleeping on the bed. The thing that surprised her was that she was now looking a bit older and more mature compared to how she looked earlier. Tatsuya looked at Kuroka, who had a playful smile on her face, and asked, "So, do you like how Chiron is looking now?" Tatsuya stared at her with a deadpan look on his face and said, "Instead of calming her down, you decided to do this. She's underage, you know, and she still have to go to school as well." Kuroka chuckled at that and jumped on Tatsuya's back and said, "Don't worry, Tatsuya. Chiron is not underage, nya. We spent a lot of time in the time chamber, so she is perfectly fine. Also, this form is only temporary since she herself is not yet able to stabilize her senjutsu in her body, so it will wear off in a week, nya." Tatsuya silently caressed her ears and looked at Kaneko, who was sleeping peacefully with her now barely covering anything clothes. He then used his magic to adjust the clothes to her size and then tucked her in and let her rest. Kuroka, who saw Tatsuya taking care of her sister, smiled and then hugged him. She then started thanking him for taking care of her relationship with her sister, to which Tatsuya just flicked her forehead and told her to not think much about it. Soon both of them left the room, leaving behind Kaneko, who was sleeping. Once they were back in the drawing room, both of them met Chow Chow and Valley, who were standing along with their male teammates behind them. Kuroka and Tatsuya stared at them, who were looking at Tatsuya intently. Tatsuya looked at Kuroka, who nodded her head and got off him and went to the others after giving her a peck on the lips. Tatsuya looked at them, and before he was able to say anything, Valley and Chow Chow said in unison, "Please train us," and bowed their heads, seeing which the other four bowed as well. Tatsuya, who already knew what they were going to ask, didn't look that surprised and said, "Follow me then," and started walking. The others immediately looked up and started following him. Tatsuya brought all of them in a separate space and asked, "What is the food that you guys like the most?" Hearing his question, all of them got confused and wanted to ask what did it have to do with their training, but still told him what they liked. Tatsuya nodded his head and then snapped his finger, and immediately 6 figures appeared in front of them. All of them were shocked once they saw who the 6 people were, but before they could ask, Tatsuya clapped his hands in order to gain their attention and said, "These are you clones, who are identical to you in each and every aspect. You need to defeat them in 3 hours or else no dinner for you tonight. Oh, before that, here, eat it," and gave each of them a small black pill. All of them looked at the pills suspiciously, but still decided to do as he asked. But as soon as they gulped the pill down, their stomachs started grumbling, and all of them immediately felt hungry. Tatsuya looked at them with a satisfied smile on his face and said, "Good, now let's begin. Remember, 3 hours or no dinner for any of you." and snapped his fingers once again, and immediately all of them appeared at different locations with their doppelgangers standing in front of them. Chapter 252. Miserable. After 3 hours were up, Tatsuya went back to the dimension where he left the others, and saw all of them lying on the ground with various injuries on their bodies, and their counterparts sitting on top of them. Tatsuya snapped his fingers, and once again all of them appeared in Tatsuya's home, and he healed all of them, though only to the point that they don't die, but still suffer pain. Tatsuya crouched down to and looked at them with an innocent experience on his face. So, how was the training? And tilted his head a bit. All of them looked at him with their half-opened eyes and thought at the same time, I want to kill this fucker. Tatsuya, who heard their thoughts, gave a satisfied smile and said, so you really enjoyed it, huh? Well then dinner is prepared as well. And used his telekinesis to bring all of them to the table and made them take their seats. All of them thought that Tatsuya would not give them food since they were unable to defeat their opponent in the given time. But to their surprise, not only there was a plate in front of them, but the dinner composed of all the dishes they mentioned earlier. All of them started to drool a bit, and their stomach were literally rotating for food. But before they could even thank him, they noticed that they couldn't move their bodies no matter how much they tried. All of them turned their eyes to look at Tatsuya, who still had an amused smile on his face, while he was giving them a thumbs up. Tatsuya then called the others as well, and all of them sat on a different table from the 6 immovable males. Kuroka and Loki, who saw their conditions, laughed out loud, and Loki, to add more fuel to the fire, went towards them and held their plates in front of their faces and said, What happened, White Dragon? Don't you want to eat this? It looks very delicious to me. He then took a deep breath and said, such a tempting smell. You sure you don't want to eat it? Veil and took a spoonful of the food and moved it in front of its mouth and said, Valley, who saw that, was totally red from anger. He never imagined that he would be embarrassed by anyone in his life like that. He tried to avert his eyes, but the aroma coming from the food which Loki was purposely holding in front of his mouth made him unconsciously drool, but since his stomach was totally empty, he wanted to glare at Loki but couldn't. The only thing he was capable of doing was to avert his eyes, which was very difficult since the aroma was totally intoxicating for him. I promise, once I am out of this paralysis, I will kill this shit of a god. Just you wait, Loki. Loki, who was done with Valley, now looked towards Chow Chow, who on seeing his gaze immediately started cursing him, knowing what was going through Loki's mind. Loki brought a chair and sat beside Chow Chow and asked, What happened, Chow Chow? Are you not going to rat this? And did the same thing he did with Valley by bringing a spoonful of food near his mouth and said, Chow Chow, knowing that this was going to happen, was somehow able to control himself from getting red in anger, but the roars that were coming out of his stomach made him feel so embarrassed that he wanted to just run away. Seeing that Chow Chow was not showing much of a reaction, Loki clicked his tongue and looked at the plate for a while. Suddenly an evil smirk appeared on his face and he said, Oh well, if you are not going to eat it, maybe I will eat it myself. After all, it would just be a waste if you don't. And immediately Chow Chow's eyes widened and he tried to glare at Loki. Loki, seeing that, smirked and slowly brought the food to his mouth and ate it, making Chow Chow feel a bit enraged by that. Not being able to eat your favorite food when you are hungry and it is right in front of you. How does it feel, Chow Chow? Feeling miserable yet? And ate another bite, making no effort in trying to hide it from Chow Chow's gaze. Seeing what was happening, the other 5 people looked at Chow Chow with pity, while being grateful that it was not them who were in his place. But then all of a sudden a small girl with black hair came towards them with 3 pups in her hands and looked at the boys. The boys, who noticed the girl, turned their eyes towards her while trying to gesture for help. Ofisama, please help us. Office stared at them for a while and nodded her head, making all of them feel happy. But then, the 3 pups that were in her hands got on top of the table and stared at the boys. The boys stared back at them, thinking what were they doing? All of the pups then went towards each of them, making them think that they had way to help them. But the pups just grabbed the dessert that they had in front of them and brought it to Office, who just placed a seat and started eating the sweets which the pups brought. The boys looked at Office with a shocked expression on their faces. They looked back in front of them and saw that their dessert was gone. All of them cursed Office in their minds, who on the other hand was now back in Tatsuya's lap, eating her sweets with a blissful expression on her face. All of them glared at her, seeing which Tatsuya whispered something in her ears. Office nodded her head and looked at the paralyzed boys and said, Thank you for the sweets. And once again started eating. All of them blinked in surprise, but soon came back to reality and started thinking whatever nonsense possible their heads. They glared at Tatsuya, who was reason for their misery, who just smiled at them and pointed at something. All of them were confused by that and followed where he was pointing, and just as they looked at that, an unimaginable rage took over their body. What they saw was the 3 god-killer pups eating the food which was present on their table with a joyous expression on their faces. Once they noticed their gazes, all of them looked back at them and stared in their bloodshot eyes that were glaring at them. But suddenly all 3 of them snorted with a smirk on their faces which sounded like, Fuck off, losers. And once again started eating the food, making the paralyzed group even more enraged at that. Chapter 253. There is no one here except us. A few days passed by and the boys of the Hero Faction and Vala Group were getting better at dealing with their doppelgangers made by Tatsuya, though they still were unable to have dinner at all for all these days. Kaneko, whose conditions were now stabilized by Kuroka's and the other Nekasha's help, was now back to normal. In fact, she was now feeling better, as she was now able to turn to her more mature form for a couple of hours a day, and even her natural growth, which had stopped for quite a long time, was now back, and she was now growing at a fast pace, making her look a bit mature even in her normal form. Tatsuya, who was back to his normal lifestyle, was once again busy with his work, was standing in front of his house with the members of the Gremory group and his team. Miyuki looked at him and asked, "You really not coming with us, Oni-sama?" Tatsuya looked at Miyuki and nodded his head. "Yeah, I already know that they can pass this promotion test without any problems, and there is also a lot of things that I have to deal with here. Who knows what might happen here when all of us are gone? Those Cows Brigade members are looking for someone, you know?" Miyuki's face turned grim as she realized what Tatsuya was talking about and asked, "Then we should stay here as well after a dash." "No need for that, Miyuki." Tatsuya interrupted her in the middle of what she was saying. "You all wanted to go to the stores Venelanis told you about, so why not go with her when you all have the chance? And while you all are there, I would be able to deal with my backlog from my trip." Hearing him mention backlog, Rosweiss sighed and said, "There is too much to take care of. It's piled up too much." All of them looked at the pair of boss and secretary with a pitiful gaze and nodded their heads. Tatsuya nodded his head as well and said, "Oh, make sure to not cause any trouble, unless someone is asking for it. Surzex was complaining to me that some of his hair have started to turn gray since my last stunt against the council." Hearing that, Rias facepalmed and gave a tired sigh while the rest of Tatsuya's team nodded their heads. Tatsuya gave a nod and then gave a telepathic message. "There is a chance that the old Satan faction might aim for the underworld. If you all get dragged in some shit, then you all are allowed to go all out, alright?" Hearing that, all of them turned serious and mentally nodded their heads. Tatsuya then looked towards the ones who would be taking the test and said, "Best of luck to you all as well. Isami, if you fail, then be prepared for some training." Isami groaned in annoyance and said, "Yeah, I will make sure to get over with this shit quickly. Don't want to train with you. And make sure to remember that I will get a week off from training if I pass the test." Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, "Fine by me." All of them then gathered in their respective groups, and then a magic circle appeared below them. "Well, they are gone now." And then looked towards Rosweiss and said, "Let us get going as well." Rosweiss nodded her head, and then started following Tatsuya back. Once they entered the house, they all were met with total silence, since even the Vala group and Hero faction members were out for their work, leaving only the two of them here along with the two dragon gods. Tiamat still hasn't returned from the familiar forest, and Kurumi was still in Kyoto hanging out with Yasaka and sparring with her. Somehow this silence is a bit weird. I have never seen my house this empty. Rosweiss looked towards Tatsuya and tilted her head and said, "Really? Well, I am a bit used to this type of silence, though my home back at Asgard was not this big, and since I was alone, I am not that bothered by it."
Ah.
Rosweiss let out a dry laugh once she remembered her days of being alone and single back in Asgard. Tatsuya looked at her and thought, "You look like you are really bothered by this." He then patted her back, making the silver-haired woman look at him curiously and said, "This also means that there is no one else except for us and the dragon gods here, you know?" Rosweiss looked at him for a while, and then as if she realized something, her eyes blinked for a while and soon a bright red blush appeared on her face. "No, we can't, Tatsuya. We should not do those kind of things before we are married, you know. That's very indecent and wrong. We can't." Tatsuya looked at her with a confused look on his face and said, "What are you talking about? Indecent? What is indecent about going through our work in silence with getting disturbed by the others?" Rosweiss was once again surprised by this, blinked her eyes in shock. Seeing that, Tatsuya smirked and said, "Heh, don't tell me. Our pure and beautiful Rose is thinking of doing something indecent with me in the head of yours," and moved his face closer to her, making the silver-haired lady blush in embarrassment. She then lifted her hands and placed it in front of her face to avoid looking directly at Tatsuya, who had a smirk on his face. "And no, I am not thinking about something indecent at all. You are mistaken. Yeah, totally mistaken." Tatsuya then grabbed the hands that were blocking his view and moved them aside and asked, "Then what is it that is going through your mind? Won't you tell me, Rose?" Rosweiss, who was now looking directly at Tatsuya, averted her eyes because of shame. Seeing that, Tatsuya smiled a little and said, "Don't worry," and then gave a kiss on her cheek and said, "Once we are done with our work, I will make sure to have a lot of skinship with you." He then stepped away from the frozen and blushing Rosweiss and said, "On that note, let's hurry up and finish our work. The sooner the better," and started walking away. Rosweiss touched her cheek with a dumbfounded expression on her face and subconsciously decides to finish her work as soon as possible. Chapter 254, Euclid's Preparations. After the little show of Tatsuya flirting with Rosweiss was over, both of them got into working mode, since seeing the pile of papers in the room was getting too much for their eyes. Ophis and Ruya, who were still in the house, went to check on them, but seeing how serious both of them were, they left the room without bothering them. Ophis even left a few of her sweets behind as refreshments and then left the pair of alone. Tatsuya and his clones were busy going through the papers, and Rosweiss as well was doing her job diligently, though there were some moments when her mind wandered somewhere, making her blush intensely, but soon she returned back to her serious self. While all this was going on at some other place, a duo of silver-haired devils were looking at a huge crowd of people standing in front of them without making any movements and having lifeless eyes. Among the crowd, two people stood out, one being a teenager wearing a red cloak and glasses, and other being a young boy with tan skin and white hair. The older-looking devil nodded his head with a smile on his face and said, "This seems good so far. Are the other preparations complete, Euclid? What about that bag of godly bones? He is not planning on going back on his words, right?" The younger devil lowered the bundle of papers in his hands and nodded his head and said, "No problems noticed, Rise of Im-sama. The hero faction members are currently under our control, and the preparations to use their members to become a medium are done. Regarding Hades' Grim Reapers and that, it doesn't seem that he is planning to go back on his words. Rizavim nodded his head with a satisfied smile and then asked, and what about our target? Any signs of them knowing about this? Euclid shook his head and said, no signs. From my sources, I can confirm that most of the members of that Basta, Tatsuya Shiba's house, are currently with the peerage of the Grimoire heiress, accompanying them for the promotion test of their members. Only Tatsuya Shiba, a Valkyrie, our target, and one other woman of unknown origin is left there with the Basta. Tatsuya Shiba and the Valkyrie working in a separate room going through some documents, and our target relaxing in the unknown women's lap while eating some sweets. Euclid said all that with a plain voice, but Rizavim, who heard all that, took a few steps back and looked at his with a weird expression on his face and asked, not wanting to be rude or anything, but, are you stalking them? Euclid, who heard that, widened his eyes in surprise and said, most definitely not. Why would I even want to stalk that fuck dash asterisk cough, asterisk, this is just so that we can know where our target currently is. Yeah, it's not like I have anything else in my mind. I am just making sure that everything goes perfectly, not that I want to know what all he do with Big Sis there. Yeah, I am not doing it to look at them making out. I really want to kill that fucker. Rizavim looked at Euclid, who had veins popping out on his forehead, and the papers in his hands were getting crushed between them. He gulped his saliva and thought, Euclid is scary. Euclid soon calmed himself a bit and said, anyway, leaving that aside, everything is in order. Now we just have to focus on how many of these are to be assigned at various places. Rizavim narrowed his eyes and was about to say something, but Euclid beat him to that and said, I am thinking of sending at least 90% of these and the Grim Reapers along with that, to that fuck dash asterisk our asterisk target's place. It will give us the high chances of killing the Basta dash, capturing the target. Though I would suggest that 99% of our forces could do a better job in dealing with him, and showed small smile on his face. Rizavim blinked in surprise and thought to himself, is it only me on Euclid Kuin is getting dumber day by day? Rizavim gave a cough and said, that indeed sounds like a good plan, but don't forget that Underworld is our target as well, and we cannot risk any chances of him getting support from there, so we need to do things keeping that in mind as well. Euclid, who heard that, became a bit disappointed, but still nodded his head and started discussing with Rizavim, waiting for Hades to send them the message. Back in Kuo Town, Tatsuya, who was busy in his work, felt that someone was looking at him for a past few days, but was unable to find anything wrong with his surroundings since a certain silver-haired devil was using the best stocky dash spying magic there is in the world. Not even entities like Great Red and other could find theagic signature behind the technique. Tatsuya looked around the room since he felt a bit uneasy, but was still unable to figure anything out. He called Ruya through his telepathy and asked her if she could detect something since she was much better at it compared to him, but she too was not able to find anything wrong. Thinking that it was a bit weird, he called both of them to the same room they were before so that someone would not try anything funny with those two. He then stood up from his seat and dispelled all his clones and said, take a break for a while, Rose. Can't have you short-circuiting because of overwork. Rossweiss dropped her pen on the table and stretched her body while sitting on the chair and looked around the room. Nearly half of them are still left. I will get us some coffee. And was about to stand up from her seat, but just as she said that, the door of the room opened with Ruya and Ophis bringing in some snacks and drinks for them and said, no need for that. Just relax. And place the things on the table. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, thanks Ruya, and Ophis, thank you for the sweets earlier. Ruya and Ophis nodded their heads, with Ruya having a wide grin on her face and Ophis with a small smile. Rossweiss gave them her gratitude as well and decided to rest along with the others. All of them then sat down and started to chat with each other without knowing what was about to happen soon. Chapter 255. Before the confrontation. Tatsuya and Rossweiss once again started doing their work while Ophis and Ruya just sat down in the room, with Ruya reading some books she got from Tatsuya and Ophis sleeping using with the God Killer pups, though she don't need to sleep. Tatsuya, who was going through some papers, suddenly saw a familiar red circle appear on his desk and stopped what he was doing, looked at it along with the others, with Rossweiss preparing for a possible attack. Soon a projection of a familiar red-headed Siscon appeared, seeing which Tatsuya raised his hand and said, Yo, Surzex, how is it going? Did they pass the test? Surzex stared silent at Tatsuya and asked, please tell me you are here, in Underworld. Tatsuya blinked for a while and said, no I am not, I still ha-dash. Why the hell can you not be here for the one that you are required? Surzex clutched his head and looked at him with a frustrated expression on his face. The whole room fell silent seeing the sudden outburst from the Mao. Even Ophis woke up from his shout and was glaring at the projection with the intent to kill. The pups were growling at him as well. Seeing that Ophis was preparing a magic circle in her hand, Ruya immediately stopped her while Rossweiss calmed down the God Killer pups. Tatsuya nodded, seeing that the situation was fine now, and then looked back at Surzex and asked, what happened that you want me to be there so badly? Surzex sighed, and then a holographic screen appeared in front of Tatsuya, showing many huge monsters, nearly 100 meters tall with a human on top of each of them. There were several other monsters who were even 200 meters tall with a human on top of them as well. Tatsuya, who saw the scene, immediately called Chow Chow, and his team and a small projection of the hero faction appeared in front of him. What happened, Tatsuya? We are busy, you know? Tatsuya ignored what Chow Chow said and asked, are these the members of your team? And pointed towards the holographic screen. Chow Chow and his team immediately turned around, and were surprised seeing the monsters in the screen. They then spotted the people attached to the heads of the monsters and were totally speechless. After they were able to calm down a bit, Cao Cao looked at Tatsuya and simply nodded his head. Tatsuya, who saw this, sighed and said, "Looks like your faction is being used to be the power source for the Annihilation Maker guy." He then turned to Surzex and said, "Miyuki and the others would still be there with Vinalana-san. Try contacting them and hold on for a bit." "Ah, about that, they along with my peerage are already at it. But since those giants regenerate and divide at a very fast pace, all of them having a bit of trouble. Well, except for one person." He then showed another projection with his team fighting off against the giants, but were not very efficient, since by the time they killed one, some more have been produced by the other giants. But amongst them, a certain blonde-hair, green-eyes girl flying on top of a blue dragon's back was firing black energy blasts which were easily able to destroy the giants. Ah, Asia is using her anti-healing technique to cut off their regenerations and destroying them completely. Wait a minute. He then formed a magic circle near his ear and called Asia. "Hello, Asia?" "Ah, Tatsuya-san, hello, did you want something?" "No, but are you alright?" "Yes, we are totally fine. Just some giant pests hindering us. Surzex-san might have already told you about, right?" "Yes, he did. And I am calling you regarding this same too. You see the people on top of their heads are from Cao Cao's faction. Check whether they are still alive or not. And please keep their bodies intact, even if they are dead." "Oh, so these people sticking out of their heads were from Hero faction, huh? Alright, Tatsuya-san, leave it to me. But there are too many of them to take care of. Regarding that, Surzex, ask your people to force teleport those giants near Asia, and Asia ask Isami to boost up and transfer the power to you. Blast them all in one shot. Oh, mind their bodies though." Surzex and Asia, who heard his plan, nodded their heads in approval. Surzex then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Aren't you going to come here to deal with the situation?" "Oh, about that, I have some company here as well." "Alright, Ruya, let them in." Ruya, who had a mischievous smile on her face, gave a thumbs up, and just as she did, purple fog started surrounding them. Surzex, who saw that, widened his eyes and said, "Kuo is under attack as well." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Well, then try to survive on your end. Ask some people to head there to help you guys. Cao Cao, call Valley and tell him that he is attacking Underworld and there might be a chance for him to be there as well. And hurry up to take care of your faction members. See you guys on a bit." And before they could even answer the him, their projections disappeared. Tatsuya looked at Rosweiss and said, "Secure all the paperwork. We don't want to do this all over again, right?" Rosweiss nodded and started placing barriers over the pile of documents to prevent them from getting destroyed. Tatsuya looked at Ruya and said, "Let them in. They must be quite frustrated by now." "Ah, but wouldn't that be funnier to let them wait a bit longer?" Alright then, Rosweiss, let's finish all these papers, and then we will get down to welcoming our guests." Rosweiss blinked in surprise and asked, "Will that he alright?" Tatsuya and Ruya just showed a charming smile on their faces which made Rosweiss totally speechless. She sighed and just nodded in agreement, and once again started going through the papers. 20 minutes later, Tatsuya and Rosweiss were finally able to finish their paperwork, and Rosweiss got ready to battle. Tatsuya stood up from his seat as well and stretched his body and looked at Rosweiss and Ruya and asked, "You guys ready?" Rosweiss, who saw the giants on the screen earlier, was a bit nervous but was still eager to know how would she fare against them, and nodded her head. Ruya just looked at him with a smile and gave a thumbs up. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Well then, I have prepared everyone's favorites today. Make sure to eat to your fill." And some of his clones started coming in the room with various dishes in their hands and started arranging their table. Rosweiss comically fell down on the ground once Tatsuya said that, while Ruya and Ophis were shouting, "Bonsai, bonsai," with their hands up in the air. Rosweiss got up from the ground and asked, Wait a minute, isn't there something more important that we have to do dash?" But before she could finish, Ruya looked at her and said, "Then are you telling us to leave this appetizing food behind, just to deal with some small fries, Valkyrie-chan?" Ophis nodded her head, asked well, and said, "You are stopping me from eating the sweets that Tatsuya prepared for me just to deal with some bugs," and stared directly in Rosweiss' eyes. Rosweiss, who soon remembered the identities of the two girls in front of her, gulped her saliva and immediately shook her head. Both Ruya and Ophis sat down to eat their food, seeing which Rosweiss just sighed. She then felt a tap on her shoulder and saw Tatsuya smiling at her with a bottle of wine in his hands and asked, "Want to drink some with me, Rose?" Rosweiss started at him with a deadpan look on her face for a while, but finally sighed and nodded her head with a helpless smile on her face. Tatsuya nodded his head, and both of them sat down to have their meal as well. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a silver-haired devil was gripping a monitor with all his strength and shouted, "Stop eating that delicious-looking fool, you fucker! How long are you going to let us stay here? Open the barrier already." Seeing him like that, the older silver-haired devil who was peeking at him from the slightly open door thought, Euclid Kuan really became a stalker. What's more is that he is stalking his brother-in-law.
Levá složená závorka chapter 256, Office v Lomitko's Chaos Brigade.
Once they were done eating their food, Tatsuya and the remaining residents of the Shiba residence stretched their bodies to get a bit warmed up. Ophis looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Are they here to get me?" Tatsuya looked at her and nodded his head and said, "Well, they are idiots, thinking that they could tame you or try to take your power. But anyways, don't think much about it. Not that big of a problem for us." Ophis stared at him for a while and nodded her head and said, "I will help as well. They are here for me after all." Tatsuya patted her head with a smile on his face and said, that would be very helpful then. He then removed the barrier that was preventing the Chaos Brigade members to enter his domain, and once again the violet fog started to surround them. This time Tatsuya didn't interfere with the process, and soon all of them were in a separate dimension which was a totally plain space devoid of any structures whatsoever. In the space, countless devils, grim reapers, and the giants made by the Annihilation Maker were present, and all of them immediately took their stance once they saw their targets preset inside the space. Tatsuya looked around for a while and then gave a whistle filled with admiration and said, you certainly prepared a whole lot to meet me, ain't you? By the way, where is my brother-in-law Euclid? The leader of the devils, which was surprisingly Shalba, who was killed by Surzex earlier, came forward and said, you don't need to worry about that, human, just give us Ophis, and we promise to kill you without any suffering. Tatsuya looked at Ophis and said, that's what he said, Ophis. Ophis nodded her head and walked forward, much to the surprise of the Chaos Brigade members who thought that there would be some resistance in the way. But seeing her accepting that so easily made the devils and the Grim Reapers smirk and think that their sheer number put a pressure on them, making the subject to them so easily. Shalba, who was about to laugh and mock Tatsuya for being a coward, immediately stopped once he felt a huge amount of black aura surrounding Ophis, and immediately fell down on his knees. He then looked around and saw that everyone except for the giants were kneeling on the ground, and then looked at the dark aura with a terrified look on his face. Tatsuya formed a barrier around Rosweiss to prevent her from being in a similar condition as the Chaos Brigade members and said, what happened, Shalba-san? You wanted Ophis, right? Go ahead, take her. Shalba glared at Tatsuya and wanted to say something to him, but the pressure which was coming out of Ophis's body, which was getting bigger and bigger, made it impossible for him to speak anything. Soon the aura around Ophis faded away, and now a huge black dragon with razor-sharp teeth and golden eyes was standing in her place. Ophis looked at her body and said, it's been a long time since I changed to my dragon form. Don't worry about destruction, I will make sure that the space don't get destroyed, said Tatsuya, assuring Ophis to not hold back against the enemies. The giants made by the Annihilation Maker started moving towards the huge dragon once they sensed that the space was stable and were ready to attack. Seeing them walking their way, Ophis as well charged magic in her mouth and was ready to fire at them. Tatsuya, seeing that, suddenly realized something and looked towards Ruya and said, bring the humans on top of their heads just before her attack destroys them. I am busy maintaining the spatial field. Ruya shrugged her shoulders and just focused on Ophis's attack so as to not miss the moment her attack connects to the giants. Meanwhile, Ophis, who had finally done charging her attack, flew up so as to get above the giants, and a huge magic circle appeared in front of her mouth. The devils and the Grim Reapers, who felt the energy inside the magic circle, started sweating and immediately deployed a barrier in hopes of not getting caught in the attack. Seeing the scene in front of him, Tatsuya smirked and said, hey Rose. The silver-haired Valkyrie, who was awestruck seeing the dragon god's magic circle, looked towards Tatsuya with a curious look on her face. Tatsuya pointed his finger towards the devils and Grim Reapers and said, nullify their barrier. You were practicing barriers lately, right? Hearing which, Rosweiss nodded her head without thinking, but soon she got back to reality and her eyes widened in shock. What? You want me to nullify all of these? Tatsuya nodded his head with an expression which said, obviously. Seeing which, Rosweiss' lips twitched in annoyance. Don't worry, I will provide the magic power to you. You just need to nullify them, that's all. That's all, my ass. And why the hell are you speaking as if this is something normal to do? She then looked at her teammates, which consisted of the two dragon gods who were supposedly the strongest beings in the world, and a human who was actually the strongest being of the world, and massaged her temples. I will have a drink after all this is over to relieve some of my stress. And various magic circles appeared around Rosweiss, whose pattern continuously kept on changing. Ruoa area. A very loud roar was heard by all the people who were present inside the spatial field, which was followed by a huge pillar of magic energy fired by Ophis, who was looking started charging another attack in her mouth. Most of the giants which were present on the field immediately got destroyed by the blast without even getting a chance to regenerate, and those which were not destroyed completely suffered major damage and were in the process to regenerate. Most of the Grim Reapers and Devils also got caught in their attack, but because of the barriers that they deployed earlier, they were able to prevent any serious injuries. Nah, this author bastard is lying. All those who got caught in the attack are hardly breathing. Heck, some of them don't even have their bodies left, said Tatsuya, staring in space as if looking at someone. What? Nothing. Don't mind me. Cough. Anyways, the Devils and the Grim Reapers, who saw the huge dragon charging another blast, started panicking, and Shalba looked at the Grim Reapers and said, there's no time. Bring that thing out. That's our only chance. The leader of the Grim Reapers, who heard that, nodded his head and raised his scythe in the sky, and then slammed it on the ground, and immediately a huge magic circle appeared. As soon as the magic circle was formed, both Ruya and Ophis stopped for a bit and widened their eyes in surprise. They certainly did prepare well to catch Ophis. Gotta admit that they at least are good enough to think that far. Tatsuya nodded and said, well, big bro Euclid is really smart, you know. Without him, the old Satan faction would have collapsed much earlier. Rosweiss, who was busy in nullifying the barriers, didn't ask anything, but was still curious as to know what that magic circle was. Soon enough, her question was answered as something started to rise up from the magic circle. A bizarre creature with the features consisting of both a dragon and a fallen angel came into view with its whole body driven into a cross by nails and blood coming out from all over its body. Rosweiss was totally speechless seeing the creature and had her mouth opened wide. The devils and grim reapers who saw the dragon god stop for a bit smirked, and Shalba said, "Speechless, huh, Ophis? Well, why won't you be? After all, this is your natural enemy, the dragon slayer Samuel. Your doom is near you, a motionless dragon Bic dash." But before he was able to finish, Samuel's whole body glowed red and started compressing before it turned into a red beam of light and got absorbed in a blue and white ball with him written over it. The ball then started flying towards Tatsuya at a very fast speed and was caught by him, who looked at the ball and said, "A dragon type? Huh. Well, a good catch." He then looked at Shalba and said, "You were saying something earlier, please continue." Chapter 257, Save the Underworld. After a few minutes of mindless carnage caused by a dragon loli, a pile of human bodies was floating behind Ruya, who was successfully able to save most of the humans on top of the giants' heads, but still a few were dead with their bodies totally destroyed, making it impossible for her to recover them. Tatsuya also had a few elite Grim Reapers and Devils from the Cows Brigade in half-dead state, restrained by magic, and decided to give them to Surzex so that he can talk with the skeleton god. Ophis, who was done with her job, was sitting on her throne made of god-killer pups who grew their sizes a bit with a lot of sweets in her hand. Last but not the least, Rosweiss was busy studying the dimensional barrier they were in, since Tatsuya told her that it was impossible for even Satan-class beings to get out of here easily, which immediately picked up her interest. The rest of the corpses? There weren't any, since Ophis's attack obliterated everyone on the field in a matter of few blasts. If not for Tatsuya saving the elites in their half-dead state, they too would have vaporized without any traces left behind as well. Once both Tatsuya and Ruya were done with their jobs, Tatsuya teleported at a distance away from there, but soon returned back with two boys, one teenager and other a child, whose bodies were shrunken so much that their skeletons could be outlined by a naked eye. "Let's go back then. Everything is done here. Rose, you can study the space barrier later. This guy is the one who made it. Ask him to help you later." Tatsuya called Rosweiss and gestured towards the unconscious George over his shoulder and then destroyed the barrier. Soon all of them were back to their previous location, and Tatsuya and Ruya immediately started putting the bodies that they brought in the underground training field, while Rosweiss brought the two almost dead hero faction members to the medical ward, where Tatsuya soon arrived once he was done dealing with the bodies and used healing magic on the two so as to heal their injuries. Now they just had to wait till they gained their consciousness back and have a meal to regain their strength. Once all that was done, Tatsuya and the others gathered once again in the room they were previously in. Ophis, who was staring at Tatsuya without saying anything, gathered attention from all of them. And even Tatsuya and Ruya were unable to know why she was doing that, since she had no thoughts about it. Tatsuya, who was used to her antics a bit, patted her head, receiving which Ophis's lips showed a small, unnoticeable smile on her face. He then smiled as well and said, "Good job, Ophis. I will make sure to make your favorite sweets tonight." Hearing which, she nodded her head with a slight glimmer in her eyes. Tatsuya then looked at Ruya and Rosweiss and said, "I will go and check the situation in Underworld, look after the people whom we have brought here," and teleported away without waiting for any response from them. "Let's go, Ratsu. Keep firing. Don't stop." Roar. Tatsuya, who teleported to Underworld at the location where he felt the presence of his teammates, was welcomed by the sight of a beautiful blonde-haired girl riding on top beautiful 10M long blue western dragon. It's just that the beautiful girl was totally covered in blood, and the dragon looked more like an evil dragon shooting lightning with a ferocious expression on his face while also being covered in blood. I could somewhat guess is what is happening here, but mind telling me about it? All of them who heard Tatsuya's voice immediately turned around with a surprised look on his face. But soon that expression turned into relief as all of them immediately rushed towards him, and some of the devils were rushing at an astonishing speed towards him. Tatsuya, who saw them, was surprised and thought, "What the hell happened here for them to look this relieved on seeing me?" and waited for the incoming devils to explain the situation to him. But before any of them could even reach him, a magic circle appeared in front of Tatsuya, and a long crimson-haired man appeared out of it and latched onto Tatsuya. "Huh, Surzex? Wadash." Surzex, who just now appeared in the area, grabbed Tatsuya's shoulders and started shaking him and said,
Tatsuya-kun.
"Please save the Underworld." Tatsuya, who was being shaken by Surzex with the full force of his Satan-class power, had some cracks formed below him and asked, "What the? How much damage did those giants cause to make you lick dash?" And oh, save the Underworld from that golden-haired demon riding on that evil dragon, and pointed his finger towards the said figures. Tatsuya looked at where he was pointing and with a frown on his face said, "That's just Asia and her family dash." "Shut that crap, bastard. I don't want to hear that. Do you think that I am lying? See these gray-haired strands. Do you think that I am lying?" Tatsuya was taken aback by how Surzex reacted and was unable to think how to react to that. What the hell has been happening here? Why is he acting like this? Tatsuya looked at others who too were taken aback by Surzex, and just before Graphia could explain, a very strong earthquake occurred, making all of them fall down on their butts, and a huge pillar made up of black magic energy appeared where the giant whom Asia was attacking earlier was. See that punk. This happened.
Asterisk boom asterisk. Asterisk boom asterisk. Asterisk boom asterisk.
A huge dome of the same magic energy which was misfired by Asia was seen a few kilometers away. And this too. Rumble, rumble, rumble. Suddenly the whole area got covered by black thunderclouds, spreading almost 10 kilometers in all directions. Multiple lightning bolts were fired at the ground, causing massive damage all over the place without any discrimination. If not for the evacuation that had already been done, then it would have been hard to tell who the terrorist amongst them really was. This as well. See this with your eyes widen open, you black-haired human OP bastard. Suddenly, a very bright green light started to come out of Asia's body, which soon died down and revealed her to be cladded in a bright golden armor. Asia looked all over her body and with an happy expression on her face shouted, "YSSS! I finally unlocked my balance breaker. Now I can kick the shit of all these bastards in a much better way." Yeah. On the other hand, Surzex was clutching his head with both his hands and shouted, "Inno, oh." Asia, who heard a sudden shout which was not really clear, saw everyone and showed a refreshing smile on her face and gave a thumbs up. She then jumped from her familiar's back towards the last remaining 200m giant and punched her with her fist covered in black magic energy and sent it flying a few kilometers away. A few moments later, a huge explosion was seen at the place where the giant was punched, seeing which a certain red-headed Mao had his eyes and mouth opened wide. Chapter 258, Surzex and Tatsuya. After Asia was done with her fight for the cause of saving the underworld, she and her familiar landed on the ground, and she looked at the others with a smile. She then looked at Surzex, whose mouth was still wide open because of shock, and with a radiant smile on her face said, "Don't worry, Surzex-san. Those giant fuckera are now gone for good. I pummeled each of those giant walking assholes to ground and made sure that those shitheads don't regenerate again. The underworld is safe now." Surzex, with his mouth still open, looked around and saw black smoke rising in the sky, and the ground looking like life has never existed on the land for as far as he could see. He then looked at Asia and thought, "Safe my ass, you adorable angelic demoness riding on an evil dragon." He then turned his head towards Tatsuya, who averted his eyes as soon as their gazes met. "Look at me, you OP bastard. Look me in the eyes and say that the underworld is safe." "Phew, that was really tiring. The new balance breaker took a lot since I am not used to it," said Asia as she deactivated her balance breaker and stretched her body. She then turned towards her familiar, which was a sprite dragon, who was now totally grown up because of training in the time chamber, and motioned him to lower his head, to which the dragon complied and lowered his head. "Good work there, Ratsu. You really did a good job there. See, everyone is totally speechless by our performance today." And looked towards the others, who just showed the girl and dragon duo a wry smile on their faces. "How about it, Tatsuya-san? We did good, right?" And looked towards Tatsuya with a smile on her face and with a face which seemed to be saying, "Praise me, praise me." Tatsuya, who heard this question, stiffened a bit, but instantly expression changed, and he looked at her with a charming smile and didn't say anything. This is the best choice. No need to say anything. Seeing his choice of response, almost all of them wanted to retort, but before they were able to say anything, Tatsuya looked at them and showed his smile to them as well. Asia and her familiar, who saw Tatsuya smile, were also smiling as they got praised by him, and Asia said, "See, Ratsukuin, even Tatsuya-san agrees. Let's do our best again when the underworld is in a crisis." "No." A certain redhead who heard Asia talking to the dragon immediately shouted, without thinking anything, making all people to look at him with a slight surprise. "I mean, Asia-kun, there is no need for you to do this much for underworld since you are not affiliated to our faction, right? It would not look good if every time we were to rely on you if something like this happens, right?" Asia furrowed her brows a bit and thought about it for a while and said, "That certainly is true. Well, it can't be helped." But then a charming smile once again appeared on her face and she said, "But don't hesitate to ask my help if my friends were in danger. After all, many of my friends live here. I will take care of the matter if something like that were to happen." Hearing those sweet words along with the charming smile and her beautiful voice, Asia looked like an angel at that moment. However, to a certain red-headed Mao, those words were nothing but threat. Those words said by Asia in a setting where almost everything in the surrounding was destroyed, smoke rising from various places, no signs of life anywhere nearby, and an Asia totally covered in blood with an evil dragon behind her made a perfect scene of dread inside Surzex's mind. To him, the smile didn't look charming even one bit. It was like a viscous smirk to Surzex's eyes, and seeing all that, a shiver went down the Mao's spine, making him shiver up a bit. He took a few deep breaths to calm himself down and looked towards the boss of the Demoness. Tatsuya, who saw Surzex looking at him, was about to use his telepathy to know what he was thinking, but before he was even able to, Surzex grabbed Tatsuya's shoulder and threw him high up in the air, shocking everyone near him. He then took out his wings and immediately flew up in the air to catch up to Tatsuya, and also transformed into his super form. Tatsuya, who was also a bit surprised by Surzex's sudden action, used his telepathy on him inside. He then noticed the Mao covered in power of destruction rushing towards him and didn't do anything. Surzex, seeing that, didn't even flinch a bit and punched Tatsuya's gut with his full power, to which Tatsuya just blocked it with his hand covered in magic so as to not get damaged by the power of destruction. The moment when Surzex's fist connected to Tatsuya's hand, a very large shock wave got released from the collision and an extremely loud noise was heard for over 100 kilometers. Surzex then freed his hand and turned back to his normal form, and with a relieved sigh said, "Hey, now I feel a bit better." He then looked at Tatsuya and with a said, thanks for being the punching bag. But in the next instant Tatsuya punched Surzex as well, who too was able to block it without much difficulty. Now then, take responsibility for Isekuin's actions and turn everything back to normal. I have too many things to deal with right now. Tell me what happened in Kuo later, and everything you know about the incident. Bye. But just as he was about to teleport, a small magic circle appeared in front of him, and a projection of Millikas appeared from it. Father! Father! One of the bigger giants suddenly came crashing down on Council Building. Grandfather got caught in the explosion and is heavily injured. Hurry up and come here. Bring Grandma and the others as well. Both Tatsuya and Surzex fell silent at the sudden news, and Surzex looked at the sky and said, of all places she could have thrown the giant, why the hell did it have to be the council? Your father is injured as well, you know? And sorry about her throwing the giant at the council. He then thought, though it is my fault since I changed the trajectory a bit to make him land near Xiaotafux. Why the hell were you at council, you bastard? It's your fault for the destruction of the council building. Surzex looked at him and said, that is not that big of a problem. Father and the other older councilmen have got more serious wounds during the war times, so they are used to it. The problem here are the weaker councilmen. They are going to make a lot of complaints now, since they might think that it is a scheme from someone who don't want them to be on the council. I can imagine the amount of paperwork that would be coming to me. Not to mention that idiot magical girl will put most of her work in my pile too. Just kill me already. Stab my heart with a holy sword and just kill me. Tatsuya looked at the Mao with pity and said, don't yet die on me. Here, take this, it will at least ease your worries a bit. Surzex looked at Tatsuya and saw him holding his hand out with a pair of spectacles in his hand and a beautiful red-colored pin in the other. Surzex looked at the items with a curious gaze, seeing which Tatsuya said, these glasses will let you read at a speed of 500 words per second. Hearing which, Surzex's eyes widened in surprise as he carefully took the specs from Tatsuya's hands and looked at it as if he was holding the world's largest diamond in his hands. Why, you are telling the truth, right? This treasure will really let me read at that speed? To which Tatsuya just gave an assuring nod. Surzex gulped his saliva, and kept the glasses in the case which Tatsuya gave him, and then stored them in his pocket. He then eyed the beautiful red pin and asked, and what about the pin? Don't tell me, it will let me write at the speed of 100 words per second or something? Tatsuya chuckled and said, nah, it's nothing that great. Hearing which, Surzex slumped his shoulders, feeling a bit disappointed. It's just let you make 5 more clones of yourself when you put your demonic energy into it. Though your power gets dived equally LL? During the later part of sentence, Surzex was already hugging Tatsuya very tightly. Tight enough to shatter any mid-ultimate class being without any problem. Thank you, Tatsuya Kun. You are the best. UWA. I am so happy right now that I couldn't tell you. I am a very blessed person to have you as my friend. Tatsuya, who was being hugged by a crying Surzex, just patted his back and let him be and thought, your dad might be dying right now, you know? Chapter 259, Meeting the Skeleton. A few days after Asia saved the underworld, Tatsuya was walking along with Surzex and Azazel, who were being followed by Rosweiss, Tobio, and Dulio, an exorcist who turned into an angel using Michael's Joker card. He was also the number 1 exorcist possessing the Longinus Zenith Tempest. Once again, Tatsuya-san, thank you for complying with my request, Dulio said, looking at Tatsuya with a smile on his face. Tatsuya looked back at him and said, for the nth time, stop that, Dulio. I already said that it was not that big of a deal to begin with. Asia also enjoys interacting with the children at the orphanage, so it's fine. I know that, but still I am glad that you decided to cook for the children at different orphanages on my request. The food you made was really excellent. The others who saw the interaction between the blonde and the black-haired boys were a bit confused as to what they were talking about. It was just Rosweiss amongst those 4 who gave a tired sigh and thought, I know that it was a good thing to do for all those children, but the fan letters that have been coming in lately are too much of a hassle to deal with. She then looked at Dulio with narrowed eyes and thought, all because of that blonde angel bastard got too emotional to the point of shedding his tears when he tried his food. Azazel, who was not knowing what was happening between Tatsuya and Dulio, gave a cough and said, by the way, why are you coming along with us? Do you have some business to deal with at the place where we are going, Tatsuya? Tatsuya and Dulio looked at Azazel, and soon all the gazes were on Tatsuya, since none of them knew why he was tagging along with them, since he was not even a part of the alliance. I haven't given you the details about Kuowa's invasion yet. Well, getting directly to the point dash. He then formed a portal in the air from which a few people dropped on the ground. Seeing the people who just came out of the portal, both Surzex and Azazel widened their eyes in shock and were left totally speechless. Even Dulio and Tobio were surprised by the people whom they just saw and narrowed their eyes. I want to ask him why a god who is part of a faction belonging to the Alliance attacked me along with the Cows Brigade? Hey, haven't I killed Shalba before? How is he still alive? Tatsuya, who heard his question, was about to answer, but then he noticed Azazel thinking about something seriously and stopped. Sephiroth growl. To think that the Holy Grail would be in the hands of the devils. This is very troublesome. They could make foes which are defeated with great effort come back to life. Seems like the world is really in the mood of fucking all of us. Surzex looked at Azazel seriously, and then back at the unconscious Shalba and thought, it's really serious matter. If what all is known about that sacred gear is true, then all of us are in great trouble. Well, except for him, of course. and looked at Tatsuya with an expressionless face. Tatsuya just put the bodies back and said, "Well then let's get going and see what the the Bone King has to say." All of them walked towards Hades' palace with a serious expression on their faces, ready to fight any people who might block their way. Did they seriously send all the Grim Reapers after Ophis? But the fact that the whole place was totally empty without any sort of noise. The only sound which they were able to hear was the sound of their footsteps. I don't think that it is necessary, but how many Grim Reapers came to Kuo? Tatsuya looked at Azazel, who asked him this question, and then looked at Rosweiss, who took out a sheet of paper from her pocket and gave it to Azazel. Azazel looked at the paper for a while and nodded his head and said, "Yup, that explains it. No need to worry you all, ease up. This place right now is even safer than you can even imagine," and passed on the sheet to Surzex, who after seeing it nodded and returned it back to Rosweiss. Rosweiss then gave the sheet to Tobio, who was looking at the paper with curiosity, who when read the number of people that were dealt by Tatsuya looked at him with a deadpan look and asked, "Why is there still a plus, even after numbers this big?" Tatsuya looked at Tobio and said, "Oh that, a few of the bodies were destroyed without any traces left of them, so we're not able to add them to the list." Soon all of them came in front of a huge door and stopped in front of it. Azazel turned around and looked at Surzex and the other members of the Alliance and said, "Now then listen up here, even if we have our suspicions on him, don't act too recklessly there so as to not ha-dash. FBI open up," and the door was locked open by Tatsuya. "Arm the Alliance. Why do I even try when this guy is around? Ah well, let's go with the flow. Hands on your back where I can see them. Get away from the little lady, you bastard." Azazel also went in the room whose door was just kicked open by Tatsuya and followed his lead. The others looked at the two idiots who just went inside and were unsure what to say about this. All of them just sighed and went in the room as well. Once all of them were inside, Surzex and the other three who just came and saw Tatsuya and Azazel having a dissatisfied expression on their faces. "What happened? Is something wrong?" Tatsuya and Azazel looked at Surzex and said, Nothing. We just realized that the bone god does not have a bone. My earlier act is now ruined. Yeah, now I just realized this, that just like the angels, he too has not experienced that since he came into existence. How pitiful." Surzex just blinked his eyes in surprise, hearing what the two idiots standing in front of him just said. He was about to say something to them, but before he was able to say it, all of them heard a voice. "Pluto, hide those magazines immediately." "And when the hell did Underworld have a branch of them?" Pluto. Yeah, he is not here right no dash." And soon they saw a skeleton wearing robe carrying a huge pile of magazines in his hand, came out from another room. The skeleton's eyes then met with those of the others who were looking at him with a surprised look on their faces. Chapter 260, Complaint. "This one as well?" "Yeah, this and this too. I can't believe he has such rare things here. There is one about gods as well? What kind of source does one need to get your hands on this epic shit? How the hell do you have these magazines? Forget about race. You have ones about gods from almost all pantheons as well. How the hell is this possible for someone who doesn't even have that, to have all these treasures? They are of no use to you. So why?" shouted Azazel while looking at Hades. "This stuff is too dangerous if it falls into wrong hands. I will make sure to keep it safe with me," muttered Tatsuya, who started to put the research books in his storage. Everyone present there looked at Tatsuya and thought, "Your hands are looking the most dangerous right now, you know?" Azazel looked at Tatsuya, who was busy stuffing away the stuff, and said, "I will help you as well," and immediately used his magic to summon all the remaining books towards himself. Tatsuya looked at the person who suddenly snatched away the treasure and didn't say anything. Azazel, who noticed him silently staring at him, didn't think much about that and stored the books before anyone could disturb him. Only the Boy X Boy ones were left there. "Have fun looking at those muscles and DS," thought Tatsuya while smirking internally so as to not cause any suspicion to Azazel. While the two men of culture were doing their stuff, the rest of the people who came along with those two were looking at the tied-up skeleton, who was looking down in shame and seemingly wanted to hide himself in a hole. "If you two are done with your stuff, shall we deal with the real reason we came here for?" Tatsuya and Azazel looked at Surzex and tilted their heads with a confused look on their faces, seeing which Surzex had a few veins popping up on his forehead. "Teak," was all that he said before pointing his finger towards the tied-up skeleton god. "Ah." Both Azazel and Tatsuya smacked their fists on their palms and nodded their heads. "Yeah, now then Hades, do you know why we are here?" asked Azazel while looking at the skeleton who was tied up in a golden chain. Tatsuya snapped his finger and 6 chairs appeared around Hades, seeing which all of them looked at Tatsuya, who motioned them to sit down. After all were seated on their chairs, they once again focused on the skeleton, who looked at Tatsuya with an angry expression on his face. "Skull." Tatsuya smiled at him and said, "Hello," and waved his hand, seeing which the god just turned angrier. "Just what are you here for?" said Hades, who was immediately met with glares from Tatsuya, Azazel, and Surzex, which immediately silenced him. "You really want to ask that, Hades?" said Surzex with a serious look on his face. "Dude, it's too late for feigning ignorance, you know. Absence of all your Grim Reapers is already saying it in itself," said Azazel, who just sighed looking at the god. Hades narrowed his eyes and glanced at Tatsuya, who noticed it almost immediately. He then smiled and snapped his finger, and several bodies started falling from a portal. Seeing the bodies, Hades was shocked, seeing his elite Grim Reapers in half-dead state. I will just be straight with you, we didn't come here to know why you did this. Those types of shit can be done on a later date with everyone. What we want to know is whether you are the only one who is involved in it, or your whole faction, asked Surzex. Hades looked at Surzex and said, does it really matter to you who all were involved in it? Oi, Hades, you do know that we are in an alliance, right? And what is the purpose of that alliance? Asked Azazel. Shut it, fallen brat. I know, and I ask once again, what is it to you, or anyone else in the alliance about what I do? Cause as far as I know, neither did the alliance that we signed breach the privacy of individual members of the alliance, nor did I do anything that was against what the alliance was for. Azazel looked at him with a bit of surprise and said, how can you say that when your subordinates were working with the Cow Dash? But Hades interrupted him and said, are you claiming that my subordinates were working with Cow's Brigade? Looks like you even suspect the members of the alliance as well, huh? Then you might have some evidence that might prove your claim, right? Because as far as I know, my Grim Reapers just reached there at the same time the members of the brigade arrived. Hearing his answer, everyone except for Tatsuya got angry at him and started to release their auras to the extent that the whole castle started shaking the pressure that was being released by the 5 of them. But at that moment Tatsuya said, then does that mean you are not working with Cow's Brigade? Hearing Tatsuya's question, all of them looked at him with a confused expression on their faces. Hades also turned towards Tatsuya, who was looking at him with a curious expression on his face, though he totally ignored the fact that instead of his usual blue eyes, Tatsuya had a pair of red ones with 3 tomos inside each of them. What is he planning? Was the thought that came to each of their minds as they looked at Tatsuya curiously. And what will you do if I said yes, Tatsuya Shiba? I wonder about that. Azazel give a call to Winnie Olympus. Huh, I mean really? You are not going to blow his whole body apart or anything that will give us more headache. Okay, just wait a minute. And stop with that look. Azazel looked at Tatsuya with a stupefied look on his face and started saying things that just made Tatsuya seem like he was an unreasonable person. In response, Tatsuya just stared silently at him without saying anything, which for some reason made him stop and did what Tatsuya asked him to do. Soon a small projection of a man wearing clothes which were barely covering his totally chiseled chest appeared in Azazel's hand. Ah, if it isn't the lonely governor of the fallen angels. So what made you remember of this famous god today? Hello Zeus, long time no see. Well, you see, a friend of mine had something to discuss with you, so can you spare me some of your time? Why was there a pause before you said friend? Well, whatever, fine, I can spare some time for your friend. So who is it? Azazel looked towards Tatsuya, who was looking curiously at him, and asked, why was there a pause? I want to know that as well. Anyway, it's nice to meet you, Zeus-san. I am Tatsuya Shiba, a man of culture and Azazel's friend. You see, there was a complaint that I wanted to register about one of MT Olympus's employee. After he said that, he was met with total silence from not only Zeus, but also the people who came along with him, and were looking at him with a dumbfounded expression on their faces. Chapter 261, Girl Problems. Currently in a huge hall inside Hades's castle, a few people were sitting around a table, having a cup of tea along with some snacks, though the atmosphere was not looking peaceful at all. Tatsuya, Surzex, and Azazel were the ones who were sitting around the table, along with 3 other people who came from MT Olympus. Rosweiss and the other 2 were standing behind Tatsuya, and the other 2 being totally vigilant, so as to make a move whenever necessary. The other 3 people who came from MT Olympus, on hearing Tatsuya's complaint, were staring at him intently, as if trying to perceive what he was. These people were some of the chief gods from their factions, namely Zeus, who was wearing clothes which were openly showing his chiseled body, Apollon, who was wearing a chiton, and Artemis, who for some reasons was wearing an armor and was glaring a bit at Tatsuya, though she is just annoyed being in a room which have huge male over female ratio. Also, the fact that this pervy fallen is not the best to hide his intentions is annoying her. Were the thoughts that Tatsuya had. Cough cough asterisk. Suddenly Apollon gave a fake cough so as to get some attention, and seeing that he was successful, he looked at Tatsuya with a smile and asked, so, you told us that you some complaints with one of our employee, more specifically Hades, huh? Can you please elaborate us on that matter? All of them then looked at the skeleton, who was sitting a bit further away from them, without saying anything. You see that skeleton god of yours? I will put it bluntly, so don't take it offensively, all right? To which Apollon just nodded his head while Azazel and Zeus just sipped on their cup of tea. He sent a few of his subordinates to kidnap a lowly. And immediately both Azazel and Zeus splurged out the tea that they just drank and started coughing violently, which only got them a disgusting glare from Artemis, though that didn't affect them much, as they soon started to laugh out loud. Apollon had his hand in front of his mouth and was slightly trembling, most likely trying his best to not laugh out loud. Surzex and Tobio were doing the same as him, while Dulio was praying, muttering something like he had heard something unholy. Rosweiss was looking at Tatsuya and was thinking, how could he say the truth in such a misleading way? And what role do you play in this? Kidnapping? Apollon was still trembling a bit and was doing his best to hold off his laughter, and asked his question to Tatsuya. The place he invaded was my territory. The house he infiltrated was mine. The girl he was aiming to kidnap is currently my responsibility. So I can say that my role is pretty huge in this matter. Apollon, who heard him, was now back to his calm self and asked, I apologize for this, but could you tell us which territory you were talking about? Kuo, it is in Japan under Shinto faction. So you are affiliated with Shinto faction, huh? Yes and no. I do have some connections to Shinto faction, but I mostly stay neutral with my own group. I just borrowed the territory where I was living, so as to make it up to my standards. And what relation do you ha dash? Are you here to get my biodata, or something? Just get on with the main subject here, said Tatsuya with a calm tone, though none of them were able to calm themselves a bit once he said that as his eyes turned a bit dangerous at that instant. You were correct. Sorry about that. We have heard some rumors about him, but who is he anyways? As I can remember, Odin just said that not messing with him was the best option, but what is his background? Who is backing him? No one. I told you, right? I like to stay neutral.
Ashu.
Did you just read my mind? Asked Apollon with a surprised look on his face. Yup, was all Tatsuya said before putting another cookie in his mouth. Isn't it a bit rude? No, it's totally wrong to read someone's thoughts. But what else could be expected of a man? Sigh. Artemis for the first time opened her mouth and started speaking her mind off openly without giving it a second thought. Leaving feminism aside, let's get to the main topic, shall we? Though she got totally ignored by the one she tried to slander and just got more pissed at Tatsuya. Zeus and Azazel high-five each other under the table with their faces not showing even an ounce of change. Take that, you feminist. Great job, brat. Were the thoughts that were in the minds of two of the leaders. Sure, why not? So may I ask how big was the scale of kid invasion? Tatsuya nodded and turned his head to look at Rosweiss and nodded his head. Rosweiss, understanding what he wanted her to do, took out a sheet of paper and gave it to Apollon and then came back to stand behind Tatsuya. Zeus and Artemis came a bit closer to see what was written on the sheet and had their expression turn to that of surprise, which soon turned to that of shock as well. All three of them looked back at Tatsuya, who had a smile on his face, seeing which all three of them had the same thoughts. Why is that smile looking scary to me? I do hope that I would get appropriate compensation for such a huge scale invasion in my territory, right? Oh, of course. But Apollon was about to say something, but Zeus interrupted him in the middle by raising his hand and asked, did you really had an invasion on such a huge scale? Because if something of such scale happened, the information would have spread out like wildfire? It's really hard to believe why can They even kidnapped the users of Annihilation Maker and Dimension Lost, and I am pretty sure that you should know what those sacred gears are capable of. You must have also seen what they used the user of Annihilation Maker for during the recent attack on Underworld. And regarding you not believing my claim about the invasion in my territory, Tatsuya then opened a portal, and soon a bumper of people started dropping down from it, and soon the huge hall was half filled with dead bodies of the Grim Reapers that came to kidnap Ophis earlier. Is this enough? These are all the Grim Reapers that he sent, whose bodies were not totally destroyed. Seeing the huge pile of bodies, both Zeus and Apollon were pretty surprised. Even though they were both pretty strong gods, dealing with such a huge number of Grim Reapers, who even had some high-ranking ones amongst them, would be too difficult even for them. They looked back at Tatsuya and admired him a bit, and thought that what Odin might have warned them about was actually correct. To have caused this much bloodshed, and seeing that you don't have any noticeable injuries as well, means that your capabilities are pretty high as well. Enough to deal with them without causing such a massacre. You are really violent and brutal even for a man, but what else should I expect? All of them were dealt with by the girl whom they were trying to kidnap, said Tatsuya while looking at Artemis with a smile on his face. Artemis immediately stopped with her mouth open and looking dumbfounded at the smiling Tatsuya. But soon she looked down with an angry and embarrassed expression on her face, with her hands trembling a bit because of both anger and embarrassment. Oh, FFFFFFBURRNN, were the thoughts of both Zeus and Azazel even raised his fist up and gave both Zeus and Tatsuya a fist bump since he was sitting in between them. Apollon was once again back to prevent himself from laughing out loud and said, certainly seems like they invaded your territory. Yeah, not to mention that I even had to take care of the things that were wreaking havoc here in the underworld. Yeah, you really helped us out with that one, though the destruction caused by you I heard about that too. The news that I received was that the situation was dealt so carelessly that the destruction caused by the one who was fending those giant monsters exceeded that of the giant itself. Well, it can't be helped. Men are known for their carelessness and doing things without thinking through. Both Serzex and Tatsuya stared at Artemis, who had a slight smirk on her face, with her glaring a bit at Tatsuya. Tatsuya just smiled and looked at Serzex and said, don't worry, Serzex, I will try my best to teach a little about holding back to violence to Asia, so as to prevent her doing something like this again. Needless to say, she is a girl. Oh, were you saying something, Artemis-san? And showed a bright smile on her face, though it only irritated the already pissed off Artemis, who was itching to use her bow on the man smiling at her. Burn, 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 were the thoughts of the two pervs who were sitting beside each other, showing a thumbs up in Tatsuya's direction from under the table. Chapter 262, Compensation. Seeing that Artemis was not going to say anything, Tatsuya took a deep breath and said, anyway, since I have stated my facts and all the evidence that I had, do you have anything to say regarding this matter? Plus, I would like to know whether your whole faction was behind this incident, or it was just the work of that guy alone? Zeus folded his arms and said, our faction was not behind this assault. We can assure you of that. And since we are talking about it, Hades, is there anything you would like to say about your innocence regarding this matter? Although the loneliness in your castle is speaking for itself that you had sent all your Grim Reapers somewhere, but still. Hades looked at Zeus and then at Tatsuya and soon sighed and said, I take full responsibility for this, and even though I despise Zeus for forging an alliance with these bats and crows, I am not insane enough to bring threat upon the entire faction just for my greediness to get my hands on her. Hearing him, all of them widened their eyes in surprise, and Azazel said, "Aren't you complying a bit too easily? Where is that 'I am not going to speak even if you kill me' thing?" Zeus nodded his head and said, "Yeah, and what about greediness to get my hands on her stuff? Did you seriously become a lolicon? And what is it about you having a spectacular stash of those magazines that I heard from Azazel? You don't even need it." Hades and the others looked at the two idiots with a deadpan look on their faces, and soon Hades said, "It's futile knowing what that human can do, and in a situation where I can't even use my powers, it's best to not retaliate. As for your other questions, no, I am not interested in underage girls and about my collection. Every being is interested in things that they don't have, don't you agree?" The others who heard that now directed a similar deadpan look at him, while Zeus and Azazel nodded their heads, but then suddenly Tatsuya said, "You said you were not interested in underage girls. Then does that mean you are into legal lolis?" "Huh. Nice observation, brat," said Azazel, widening his eyes a bit, and then looking towards Hades, who was staring at Tatsuya without saying anything. Tatsuya looked back at him, and also started staring, but soon Hades averted his eyes, and looked towards Apollon and said, "Leaving those things aside, what my punishment is going to be? Hey, don't change the topic, you skeleton king." "Yeah, we want to know. We want to know." But everyone else ignored the two people who wanted the answers, and once again started discussing. While they were discussing, Tatsuya formed a mental link with Hades and asked him telepathically, "Why are you keeping this quiet? And don't react, just think and I will hear you." Once Hades heard a voice in his head, he was about to shout, but stopped himself when he heard the latter part. Tatsuya Shibaha, "Well, even if I say something right now, the chances of them listening to me are close to none. And if I tell them the real identity of that girl that you are protecting, you will find a way to refuse that as well. There is no reason for me to dig my grave any deeper than it already is. Aren't you a really smart person? Why did you not use that brain of yours before even sending your Grim Reapers at my place? When you get to know that there is a thing that could get rid of the something that you despise, plus you have the means to get your hands on that thing as well, what do you think would you do?" A valid point, but still, why go so far to deal with the fallen and devil that you even joined hands with the Cows Brigade? "No reason, I just despise them because I despise them, and since that idiot of a leader of my pantheon signed a peace treaty with them, there was not way that could not feel agitated at that. Just think about it, who the hell is going to willingly work with someone they despise the most? And I will repeat again, I didn't join any hands with Cows Brigade. I was only using them to stall time, and to stop you from doing anything unnecessary. I would have taken that girl away once their job was done. I was even going to return her back once all the devils and fallen would have vanished. But looks like my plan didn't go well at all. Well, anyway, after all this, when I don't have any subordinates and my powers are sealed, do you really think I am in a mood to do anything stupid? I already learnt my lesson, and I am not going for a revision anytime soon. Whatever, like you said, I would have found some way to deal with the situation if you would have told her identity, or dealt it with some other way. Seems like you were smart enough to not try that. Hahaha, I know I may look like one, but I am not an evil god, you know? I just don't like any other races from different factions, that's all. Anyway, what punishment you are going to ask for to give me? Aren't you quite sure that I would be the one who will give you the punishment? Stop acting like that, like a person as scummy as you would not know whose side the scale is tilting right now. Act respectfully, you bone shit. Don't forget that I still have the chance to give you the punishment. Doesn't matter to me what is going to happen after this. I was prepared to face death after this anyways. After all, the one I was trying to kidnap was one of the strongest beings of the world. Leaving that aside, I saw that you kept my treasure with you earlier, huh? Oh, I almost forgot. Man, where the hell did you buy those from? Don't shout in my head, you bastard. Anyway, leaving that aside, what do you plan on doing now? Nothing at the moment. I don't have any subordinates right now, so making plans of wiping the existence of the crows and the bats is out of question. Cocytus is sealed very tightly anyway, so no need to fear about that. Oh, what happened to Samuel? I released 50% of it, for your information. It is in my care. No need to worry about that. Say, I have noticed that this place is relatively cold. Is it same throughout the year? I mean, yeah, there are a lot of undead like ghouls and zombies that live here, and you should be knowing that heat is not their best with, so it is always cold here. It's relaxing in a way, you know. Once you get used to it, that is. Say, want to work for me? Work for you? Forget it. I may take some steps that might not be in the favor of our faction, but by no means I am gonna betray them. No need to worry, it's not that kind of job. Anyway, it's not like I am giving you a choice to begin with. Tatsuya then cut off his mental link with Hades, much to his annoyance, as he still wanted to say a few things to Tatsuya. Tatsuya then raised his hand, seeing which the discussion that was going on between the others stopped as they looked at Tatsuya curiously. If you don't mind it, would you let me decide his punishment and my compensation while we are at it? There is no way we can do that. Not only are you an outsider from our faction, but a man as well. There's no way that can be accepted. Rigdash. Sure, go ahead. Really, that helps us a lot, man. Before Artemis could ask her fellow gods about it, they were already done with their answers, which made Artemis stop speaking and looked at the two other gods with a look which said, "You guys are idiots or what?" Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Then first about my compensation. I want Hades's territory." As soon as Tatsuya stated his demand, not only the 4 Olympian gods, but the people who came along with him were looking at him with their eyes and mouth opened wide, not able to believe what the hell he was saying. Wait a minute, are you saying that you want the whole realm of the dead? Asked Apollon. Yes. Why? Are you planning to take his position of the god of death or something? Asked Zeus with an excited and expectant smile on his face. Huh. No, I already have my hands filled with other things. Huh. Then you just want it as a trophy for show-off or something like that. Seriously, why do all of you men like to show off? Said the man-hater present in the room. Huh. Aren't you the only one amongst us who is showing off her expensive armor and bow? What's the use of those things in a meeting? It's for sell dash. And don't say anything like self-defense or that kind of shit. Like hell could a god know how to summon his weapons from afar or store them in a separate dimension. Now that you mention it, isn't it the new armor that you ordered earlier and got it delivered just a few days ago? Said Zeus, checking out the armor, her chest. Really, it does seem brand new, huh? Said Azazel, also checking out the armor, her chest. Tatsuya, who clearly understood what the two idiots were doing, sighed and checked the armor as well before giving a nod and said, and no, I have no reason to show it off or something. It's for my business, which have been quite a bit stable for a while and can include a new outlet for my funds. We don't have any problems with that, right? Rossweiss, who was standing behind him, nodded her head, affirming him, but soon massaged her temples, thinking that her workload was about to increase very soon. Chapter 263. End of the meet with Olympians. After Tatsuya told his demand, there was some negotiation between him and Artemis, who was intent on not letting him have the whole realm of the dead, and in the end it settled with Tatsuya getting 2/3 of the land in the end, though with this too Artemis was not much satisfied, but once Zeus told that this was the final, she stepped down from the argument. Apollon then contacted someone in MT Olympus, telling them to prepare the necessary documents for the following deal, and once he was done he looked at Tatsuya and said, well then I hope that you are fine with this. We will contact you in a day or two, so where do you want to finalize the deal? How about Kuo? Just give me a call before coming, I will set up the arrangements according to that. Fine. Kuo it is then. Now heading to the second part. What about him? Said Apollon and looked towards Hades. Tatsuya looked at Hades as well and said, since he has no subordinates right now, all of us can say that his duties are currently not needed, all right. Since Cocytus is sealed tightly, and I too would make sure that it remains the same as well. So currently MT Olympus is not in need of his duties, right? At this all of them looked towards Zeus, since it would be his word which will tell whether Hades was needed somewhere or not. Zeus then folded his arms and closed his eyes, thinking about something, and once he opened his eyes he looked back at Hades and said, nope, he is currently free from any work, and since training new Grim Reaper would take a while, I don't think that he would be having any duties for quite a while. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, as I thought, then would it be fine for him to work under me, till everything is back to normal? Since he has both the knowledge and experience of living here and the terrain of the region, he would be quite helpful to me. I even allow him to find some new recruits for the Grim Reapers and train them for the job. He will be quite helpful to me and my business here, and you lose nothing in it as well. Of course, since he is a god, I would not make him a slave since it would reflect badly on your pantheon's image, but his powers would be sealed, and he would be working like a normal employee. Of course, that means salary and living facilities as well. Hearing that, almost all of them looked at Tatsuya with a surprised look on their faces, but soon a few of them remembered that even Loki was working under him and has not been making trouble since then. The three gods then started discussing amongst themselves, and in the end, even Hades was asked about this, or he wants some other punishment if he finds working under Tatsuya disgraceful. But to their surprise, Hades nodded his head, accepting Tatsuya's offer, and said, I am going to be punished anyway, so being in a place that I am already used to is better than being in some prison or getting sealed off somewhere unknown, and since my powers would be getting sealed in either case, it doesn't matter anyway. Hearing his answer, the Olympian god sighed and approved of Hades working under Tatsuya with his powers being sealed off as his punishment. There were some other conditions added, like Hades having no relation with MT Olympus during the period he was working under Tatsuya, so as to not let sensitive information get out and all. Once they were done, the Olympian gods stood up and said their byes to one another. Zeus even invited Azazel to go be him a tour in his region, but because of the work he had to decline the offer. Soon all of them left, and once they were gone, Tatsuya looked at Hades and removed the chains that were binding him, though a small golden chain was wrapped around one of his arms like a bracelet. Well then, Hades, Kuin, let me get you acquainted with your new boss. He then looked at Cerzex and Azazel, who too were now exhausted because of their own deals that they did to get their compensation for the attack in their territory, and said, looks like it went well for all of us, huh? Cerzex face-bombed and said, yeah, but we still don't have any links to Cow's Brigade, and since you mentioned that they have the Holy Grail, the people who were defeated would be coming back to life soon as well. Sigh, it's really frustrating. Azazel nodded and said, yeah, that it is, but it cannot be helped. All we can do is be prepared. Let's hold a meet to call some new factions into the treaty. What do you say, Cerzex? Cerzex gave it a thought and then glanced at Tatsuya and made a displeased expression on his face. I think it would be good. Don't want to have help of his teammates once again. Having more allies. No, having more safe allies would be better in a situation like what happened recently. If they can do it once, they can do it again as well. Azazel smirked and nodded his head and then said, well then it looks like we are about to get busy. So where should we hold the conference? You fine with us keeping it in Kuo? And glanced towards Tatsuya. Tatsuya thought about it for a while and said, just tell me when and where, and I will look after the arrangements. Currently, I don't know what would happen if there are some spies mixed in your subordinates. Make sure to check them on a regular basis as well. Oh, you agreed rather easily, huh? Well, better for us. And yeah, it is quite problematic since a lot of devils who were in support bit old Satan faction and were hiding are slowly showing themselves now. Best of luck, Sirs X, and then teleported away. Seeing him teleport, Tobio did the same as well, and was soon followed by Dulio, who bowed his head once again to thank Tatsuya, and then went back to heaven. Sirs X gave a tired sigh after recalling Azazel saying best of luck to him, and slumped his shoulders, imagining how much work it is going to be to check the entire devil territory. I will drag that hold-up green-haired genius out of his lab if he tries to ditch this work on me. And then teleported as well. Tatsuya and Rosweiss, who were the only ones who were left behind along with their new employee, looked at each other, and then Tatsuya threw a master ball at Hades, who soon got covered in red light, and was then absorbed by the ball. Rosweiss saw this scene with a deadpan look on his face and asked, was it really necessary? Nope, but Loki would have been upset if he found out that the one who is going to work under him is not captured by the ball. Oh, speaking of capturing, here catch dash, and threw another ball towards Rosweiss, who caught the ball with a surprised look on her face, thinking that she was about to be sealed in it as well, but nothing like that happened, much to her relief. She then glared at Tatsuya, saying why did he scared her, to which Tatsuya just laughed and said, there is no way I am going to catch one of my lovers like that. Hearing which, Rosweiss immediately had a deep blush on her face. Anyways, since you didn't have a familiar, like the other, take care of that. Samuel is in there after all. By Samuel, do you mean the one which you captured a few days ago? Tatsuya just nodded his head in response, making Rosweiss a bit tense thinking about the being that was inside the small ball in her hand, but soon snapped out of it once she felt Tatsuya grabbing her hand and saying, anyway, since we are already done with this, how about we take a day off and go on a date? What do you say, Rose? Rosweiss, who heard the suggestion, was surprised and started to get embarrassed, but before she could say anything, Tatsuya pulled her hand and teleported away, leaving the whole Hades' castle empty. Chapter 264. On the Way to Heaven. A few days passed by since Tatsuya had his deal with the gods from MT Olympus, which was followed by Rosweiss' date. Needless to say that it ended with them staying the night at the hotel doing indecent stuff. And no, we are not talking about hand-holding. Rosweiss, who had her first time during her first date, felt conflicted, since even though she felt happy about it, the fact that it happened on her first date was still a bit bothering to her. If not for the fact that both of them were enjoying so much and had drunk to the limit they could, which led them to that situation. Also, the fact that she was being teased by the fellow members of the Shiba residence was not helping her out a bit. Tatsuya himself had no problems with it, but still felt that deactivating his alcohol resistance so that he could enjoy was a bad move on his part. He was confident that he had enough self-control, but it seemed like a drunk Rosweiss, who had taken off most of her clothes because of feeling hot, was too much for his not-so-well sanity. Also, taking the fact that she was the one who initiated the kiss, which led to all that drove his desires further, was also there. Tatsuya also got the necessary documents from MT Olympus about the deal that they made, which were delivered by Apollon and Artemis. Tatsuya also invited them for dinner that day, and he to admit seeing Artemis having a footgasm was the best feeling he felt since meeting her. He made sure to record that and send it to her at a later date. Currently, Tatsuya was on his way to heaven, along with Isami and Zenovia. Since the day Rosweiss got Samuel as her familiar, Isami was made to train against the Dragon Slayer, and during those times her Ascalon got severely damaged by the Dragon Slayer's poison. Zenovia too had his sword damaged very badly when she asked to spar with Himari, who cut the extra Randall in half using her flame sword, making her feel guilty about it, and continuously apologizing to Zenovia. Tatsuya, who could easily repair the swords, thought that it had been a long time since met Gabriel, and the others decided to let them deal with this while he would tour around heaven, since it was his first time going there. Hey Zenovia, have you ever gone to heaven before? Asked a curious Isami, looking towards Zenovia. Zenovia, who heard that question, looked towards Isami and said, I had a few chances to go there along with my master when there were some serious missions that we needed to take, but the only places that I have seen there are the reporting rooms where I used to get the job, information and other things like that. So my experience is same as yours. Heh, then let's look around once we reach there. I would like to get my extra Randall get repaired as soon as possible, said Zenovia. Hearing her answer, Isami snorted and pouted. She then jumped towards Tati and caught his arm and said, then what about you, Tatsuya? Want to look around with me? We haven't gone on a date together for quite a while as well. Tatsuya, who looked at the excited Isami, smiled a bit and said, fine, it's my first time there as well, so sure, let's look around together. Hearing his answer, Isami's smile widened as she said, yeah. A date it is then. Zenovia, who looked at the couple forming plans about the date, remained silent for a while and said, I will just drop my sword by and wait for them to repair it, since I don't think it would be that quick. She too then latched onto Tatsuya's other arm and said, you guys don't mind me accompanying you too, right? Hearing that, both of them looked towards her with a slightly surprised look on their faces. Soon Tatsuya thought about what she asked and didn't answer it immediately. He looked towards Isami, who stared at Zenovia, more specifically the arm to which he was clinging to. Soon a sly smirk appeared on her face and said, oh, don't tell me, you want to go on a date with Tatsuya as well. Zenovia, hearing that, nodded her head and with a slight unnoticeable blush on her cheek said, yeah, I want to go on a date. Hearing her answering without the reaction she was hoping for, Isami clicked her tongue and said, act a bit shy, will you? But soon her smile came back on her face and she said, but sure, I don't mind at all. A double date it is then. Tatsuya, who saw both of them having fun, smiled and said, don't get overexcited here, or you might get tired there and not enjoy to the fullest. Isami and Zenovia looked at him and Zenovia nodded her head in approval, but Isami had a teasing smile on her face and said, oh, don't worry about me tiring out. You do know how much stamina I have, right? which immediately earned her a smack on her head from Tatsuya as he said, "Also, don't try to corrupt any angel there. I don't want to be the reason for the large increase in fallen angel population. Understood?" Isami, who rubbed her head because of the pain, nodded her head in approval and didn't say anything. Tatsuya smiled and stopped walking once he noticed that he has arrived at the location that they decided to meet at, which was a huge church. Soon 3 people came there who most likely were their escorts on their way to heaven. Amongst the 3 of them, Tatsuya knew 2 of them, as they were none other than Dulio and Gabriel. On the other hand, there was another beautiful woman who most likely was in her 20s, wearing a nun's outfit. She was someone that Tatsuya have not met earlier, but by direction of her eyes, which was looking towards Zenovia, who in turn was looking away with her face totally covered in sweat, made him aware of who might the new lady be. Once the 3 of them were close enough to Tatsuya, and the other 2, Dulio immediately greeted the 3 of them, while Zenovia started to fidget around more on seeing the new woman's gaze. Tatsuya too saw something different as he noticed that there was slight nervousness on Gabriel's face. He was about to use telepathy to know what she was thinking, but she immediately said, "Don't read my mind, please, Tatsuya," with a slight blush on her face. Seeing that the most powerful detection ability, the women's intuition, had already perceived his actions, Tatsuya didn't use his telepathy to respect what she asked for. It was not because of the fact that the blushing Gabriel was too adorable to look at which made him stop. Definitely not. Seeing that the atmosphere turned quite awkward between them, Dulio took charge and introduced himself to the 2 new people whom he met for the first time. "Nice to meet you all, and even though Tatsuya-san already know me, for the 2 ladies who are meeting me for the first time, let me introduce myself. I am Dulio Gesualdo, reincarnated angel. Nice to meet you. Aware of my manners, let me introduce myself as well. I am Griselda Curta, a reincarnated angel as well. Also, you may have noticed it already, but I am Zenovia's guardian as well." She then looked at Zenovia and with a smile on her face said, "Let's have a talk later, alright? After all, it's been a long time since we met." Zenovia, who heard the sweet words coming out of Griselda's mouth, gulped her saliva and reluctantly nodded her head. Chapter 265, Looking Around. After all of them introduced themselves to each other, Gabriel opened a portal to heaven, and soon all of them were in front of a golden gate. Seeing the majestic golden gate and scenery around it, which looked like they were above the clouds, Isami had her mouth open wide and said, "It really feels like we are in heaven. It's truly beautiful." Hearing her say those words, Gabriel giggled, making Isami a bit embarrassed. Gabriel then looked at her and said, "Thank you for the compliment." Soon Dulio, who had gone towards the gate, came back and said, "I have made their arrival registered, so we are allowed to go now." Gabriel nodded, and then walked towards the gate, which slowly opened, causing a dramatic effect. Tatsuya looked at the gate for a while, and had to admit that the entrance of the heaven was truly something that he had imagined that heaven would be like. He then increased his pace a bit, seeing that the others were far ahead of him. Once he reached there, Griselda looked at him and said, "I will guide these 2 to the place where they could get their swords repaired." Hearing that, both Isami and Zenovia nodded their heads, though Zenovia had a frightened expression on her face. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Well then, you 2, let's look around after you are done with giving your swords for the repair, alright?" The 2 of them nodded their heads with a smile on their faces, and then started following Griselda. Tatsuya then looked at Gabriel and Dulio, but soon realized that Dulio had already gone, and now it was only Gabriel and him left behind. Meanwhile, behind some building, Dulio, who was looking at Tatsuya and Gabriel from a distance, had a cup of coffee and some snacks to go along with it in front of him and thought, "Do forgive me for not accompanying you, Tatsuya, and that too after all that you did for the children of the orphanage. However, Michael-sama has asked me to do this for Gabriel-sama in heaven, though that it is for the appearance's sake now that I think about it." He then formed a small magic circle near his ear and said, "Michael-sama, all the preparations are done. Those 2 are now alone. Good job, Dulio-kun. Keep an eye on the surroundings and make sure no obstacle comes in their path. I have worked very hard to make my sister realize her feelings without getting her fault. Don't worry, Michael-sama. I will do my best to prevent anything that could ruin this opportunity for Gabriel-sama," and then stopped putting the magic in theagic circle, making it disappear. Tatsuya, who was left alone with Gabriel, looked at her and saw that she was acting a bit flustered. He wanted to know what was wrong with her, but knowing that she had asked him to not use telepathy on her, he stopped and asked, "Is everything fine with you, Gabriel? You are acting a bit flustered." Gabriel jolted a bit when she heard what Tatsuya said that, and looked towards him only to find him looking at her with a bit of worry on her face. Tatsuya, who noticed her blushing up but had a wild guess about what was happening, but he decided to wait a bit until he was absolutely sure about it. "And no, don't worry about me, I am fine," said Gabriel, waving her hands in denial. Tatsuya, who saw her acting like that, was not the slightest bit convinced, but still decided to go with what she said since he didn't want to put her in a tight spot. He gave a sigh and with a small smile on his face said, "All right, if you say so. Do you mind showing me around here just like how we did when we first met?" Gabriel, who saw Tatsuya's small but reassuring smile, stopped acting flustered and started to calm down a bit. Soon a small smile appeared on her face as well, remembering the first time when she met Tatsuya back in Vatican. She chuckled remembering those days, and with her usual innocent look on her face, moved her hand towards Tatsuya and said, "Then let's hurry up. This place is very big to explore, you know," and showed a wide smile. Tatsuya, seeing her smile, smiled as well and held her hand and said, "Let's go then." Gabriel nodded her head, feeling happy that Tatsuya was looking happy as well, though she didn't notice that there was a slight blush that appeared on her cheeks. She then pulled Tatsuya's hand lightly and started guiding him around the place with enthusiasm. Tatsuya, who was being dragged by the enthusiastic seraph, gave a helpless smile, remembering time she did the same with him in Asia back in Vatican. He then stopped on his path and gave a slight tug to her arm, feeling which she stopped as well and looked at him with a curious look on her face. Tatsuya, who was slightly behind her, wails and stood beside her, and then interlocked his fingers with her, making the seraph a bit surprised by that action. He then squeezed her hand a bit, making her get out of her trance, and said, "There is no need to hurry up, let's enjoy all this slowly. We can just do this again at a later date if we have not explored the whole thing, alright?" Gabriel, who was a bit embarrassed by Tatsuya's sudden move, looked down and nodded her head shyly, seeing which Tatsuya forgot to breathe for a moment. He then took a deep breath to calm himself a bit and said, "Shall we continue then?" To which Gabriel replied with a smile and a blush which seemed to have appeared once again on her face. She too then held Tatsuya's hands a bit tightly and started walking around, showing him around once again. Thought this time, instead of the enthusiastic atmosphere that was around them earlier, was replaced by a sweet one which no one among the people who were looking at them wanted to disturb, and only wanted to enjoy looking at the two of them. Chapter 266. Date with Gabriel 1. While the seraph and the human were walking hand in hand, they stopped at various shops that were set up in the heaven, as well as at the other facilities built there. Tatsuya, who noticed that the places that they were visiting were usually empty, that it was Michael's scheme, but didn't told about it to Gabriel, who was actually enjoying such an atmosphere. If she doesn't have any problem with it, then what problems do I have? At a distance, Dulio, who had a burger in his hand, was looking at the two of them through a pair of binoculars, while also informing some other people through a walkie-talkie. "So, you guys are trying to set the two of them up?" Suddenly, Dulio heard a voice and flinched, since he didn't notice the person approach him because of being focused on Tatsuya and Gabriel. He turned around and saw Isami standing there with a burger in her hand, as well, which she bought from a nearby shop. Dulio also noticed Griselda and Zenobia talking to each other, though it was only Griselda who was talking, scolding while Zenobia was sitting in front of her and apologizing for turning into a devil and not contacting her. He looked at the two of them with a sweat drop before turning back to Isami and said, "Miss Hayadu, yes, what you said is indeed true. So can I ask you to please give them some alone time for now? We promise to arrange the best experience for you to sightsee once this is done." Isami thought for a while and sat down on the seat in front of Dulio's and said, "I don't know, man. I need to ask this with the squad first. Wait a minute." She formed a communication magic circle near her ear and called someone. "Hello, Kurumi-san. Isami here. Yeah, you see, the people here in heaven are asking me to not interfere in their attempt to set Tatsuya and Gabriel-san up. So what's the decision?" Kurumi, who was currently bathing along with the others, nodded as she heard the info from Isami. "Wait a minute, dash." She then looked at the others and said, "Isami told me that the people in heaven asked her to not interfere in their attempt to set Tatsuya and Gabriel-chan. Anyone have problems with it?" Hearing that, all of them just relaxed back in the bath and shake their heads in denial. Even Miyuki and Asia didn't say anything to oppose this, as Miyuki had a favorable impression of Gabriel, while to Asia she was her first female friend. Seeing that, Kurumi nodded her head and said, "No problems here. Do as you want. Akame bye." The magic circle then disappeared and Isami looked towards Dulio and said, "No problems on our side. I will be expecting VIP treatment, alright, Dulio-san?" Dulio nodded with a smile on his face, feeling grateful for her understanding. Isami smiled as well, and then held something in her hand and pointed her finger at it and said, "Dulio-san, can I get a limited edition extra large deluxe chocolate parfait?" With a smile on her face. Immediately the smile on Dulio's face disappeared and he thought, "Why do I have a feeling that my this month's salary is in a big danger?" Dulio just nodded his head with a dumbfounded expression on his face, seeing which Isami smiled and called the angel who was working as a waitress and ordered her parfait, plus some extras. Looking at Isami with his lips twitching, Dulio thought, "I will settle this with Michael-sama later." Tatsuya and Gabriel were currently in the middle of a forest made up of various types magical, consisting both common and legendary trees. Tatsuya looked around and then used his magic to search the area nearby to know where their destination might be. He then looked at Gabriel and asked, "Are we going to the lake?" Gabriel looked at him with a smile on her face and nodded her head and said, "Yeah, I always wanted to go there with a friend of mine. Or is it that you don't like lakes?" Gabriel, who was giving him with puppy eyes, made him totally speechless. He wasn't going to deny that in the first place, but her looking at him like that even made accepting it to take long. Instinctively, he placed his hand on top of her head and said, "It's not like that, Gabriel. I would love to go to the lake with you. So please don't make that kind of face. It's bad for my heart. She can easily rival Ophis when she is in the mood of being spoiled and cutesy, and believe me, that is enough to kill all the cultured people in the whole multiverse because of excessive loss of blood through nosebleeds," thought Tatsuya. Gabriel's face brightened up once again, and she clung to Tatsuya's arm in excitement. "Thanks, Tatsuya. You are the best," and then once again started pulling him a bit, wanting to reach the lake faster. Soon both of them stood in front of the lake, whose water could be considered as the purest that Tatsuya has ever seen. Tatsuya walked towards the lake and crouched down near the edge and took a handful of water from it. He then stared the water in his hand and said, "This lake is enchanted with purification, right?" Gabriel, who heard Tatsuya answer, nodded her enthusiastically and said, "Yes. Father made that lake here, and just like you said, there is a purification enchantment placed on the lake itself. Not to mention this water has great medicinal properties as well." It's really effective since it let us help in healing the injured when there are a lot of people who got ikurade during the battle. Though that sort of situation have not happened since the Great War. Tatsuya nodded his head listening to the info she was giving him. Gabriel then walked to the edge of the lake as well and sat down on the grass while immersing her legs in the lake. She then looked at Tatsuya and patted the ground beside her, gesturing him to sit beside her. Tatsuya folded up his pants a bit and then sat beside her. Once he sat down, his legs started to feel very comfortable as the lake started to show its magic and started to deal with the stress that has been accumulated from all the walking. Gabriel looked at his surprised face and said, "It's great, right?" Tatsuya looked at her, who had a smile on her face, and nodded his head without saying anything. Seeing her having a comfortable expression on her face, along with the peaceful surroundings, made him smile and think that Gabriel was looking absolutely beautiful at that moment. Seeing his expression, Gabriel blushed a bit, not knowing why, but still averted her eyes. And no matter how much she tried, she was not able to look directly in Tatsuya's eyes. Not understanding why that was happening, Gabriel decided to distract her mind a bit and asked, Yeah. No. Tatsuya, are you feeling hungry?" Tatsuya, who got surprised by her suddenly yelling, was about to answer, but before he was able to, Gabriel took out a basket out of nowhere and said, "Then please have this," and shoved the basket in front of Tatsuya. Tatsuya stared at the basket for a while before taking it from her hands and said, "Thank you, Gabriel. Did you made this yourself?" Gabriel vigorously nodded her head with an expectant look in her eyes and asked, "Will you eat it with me?" Tatsuya nodded his head with a smile on his face and placed the basket on his lap and then opened the lid and asked, "Then recommend me something, since you are the one who took the effort in making it." Gabriel, who heard that, narrowed her eyes and placed her hand on her chin, thinking about what should she give it to Tatsuya first. After doing some very hard mental work, she finally placed her hand inside the basket, making Tatsuya sigh in relief, since he started to wonder how many things has she prepared. Soon she took out a plate which was much larger compared to the basket itself. "Here, try these stuffed pockets then," and took one of the stuffed pockets from the pile that was on the plate and gave it to Tatsuya after wrapping it in a napkin. Tatsuya took it from her hands and saw her taking one for herself as well, but instead of eating it, she was looking intently at Tatsuya. Seeing her acting so passionate, Tatsuya chuckled since this was the first time he has seen such a look on her face. He then took a bite, seeing which Gabriel gulped her saliva and waited for him to answer. Once Tatsuya was done eating, he looked at the pocket in front of it, checking out the stuffing inside it and said, "Gabriel, you use sugar instead of salt?" and looked at her with a helpless smile. Chapter 267. Meeting Michael. After Tatsuya pointed out her mistake, he was busy trying to cheer up the saddened seraph, which was not working at all. He then patted her head and said, "Don't worry, Gabriel, it is just a basic mistake that anyone can do. I mean, if it weren't for the sugar, they would have turned to be very good." Gabriel looked at him with a curious look on her face and asked, "Really? You are not lying, right?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "No, I am not lying at all, even I had done this mistake sometimes." Hearing that, Gabriel widened her eyes and asked, "Even you do mistakes, Tatsuya?" Tatsuya nodded his head and removed his hand from top of her, making her look towards the hand with a dissatisfied expression on his face. "Even if I not look like it, I still am a human, you know?" Gabriel then widened her eyes as if realizing something and said, "Yeah, Tatsuya is a human as well, I just realized it," and looked at him with a smile on her face. But then suddenly Tatsuya grabbed her cheeks and pulled them while asking, "What do you mean by that, Gabriel? Do you mean to say that I am not a human? Na a don mia the AAALW.
Foi se audia.
No, I don't mean that. I apologize. Forgive me, Tatsuya." Tatsuya then released Gabriel's cheeks, who immediately cupped them and started to massage them while looking at Tatsuya with some tears at the corner of her eyes and said, "Tatsuya, you are very mean. It hurts, you know." Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, "It's your fault for saying that I am not a human, so just think of it as your punishment." Gabriel looked away with a pout, noticing which Tatsuya chuckled, which made the seraph look at him with an expression which said, "What is so funny about it?" Tatsuya then flicked her forehead, making her groan in pain once again. "Hey, why did you dash?" But she stopped midway once she saw Tatsuya take something else out of the basket she gave him earlier. Soon Tatsuya took out a plate filled with sandwiches. He then took one of them and ate a bit from it and said, "Yup, they are good. Looks like you didn't mess up on this one." Gabriel puffed her chest and said, "Humph. After all, I am seraph, you know. I don't mess things up that much." "Means that you mess things up on a regular basis, huh?" thought Tatsuya, but decided to keep it to himself. He then felt Gabriel poking his cheek with her finger and looked towards her, who, when noticed that Tatsuya had turned around, pulled her hand back and opened her mouth. Tatsuya looked at the beautiful seraph, who was opening her mouth cutely for a while before he brought the sandwich that was in his hand towards her mouth and thought, "She won't fall because of an indirect kiss, right?" Gabriel then took a bit from the sandwich Tatsuya was holding, and Tatsuya made sure to look at her intently to stop her if she started to turn into a fallen. Yes, they are good," said Gabriel, having a bright smile on her face. She then snatched the sandwich from Tatsuya's hand and said, "Now my turn, open wide, Tatsuya," and Tatsuya, without hesitating a bit, took her up on the offer and opened his mouth. Gabriel then fed him the sandwich with a happy smile on her face. Once both of them were done with their lunch, which included with both of them feeding each other, except for the coffee jelly which solely belonged to Tatsuya, without baby discussion about the topic, both of them decided to see some other places. Tatsuya stretched his body and asked, "So, is there somewhere else you want to go?" Since there was a place like this which you wanted to go with a friend, there must be other places like these as well, right? Gabriel pondered about what Tatsuya said for a while and then looked at Tatsuya and said, there are a lot of places that I want to go together with you, but not many of them are here in heaven. So, will you go together with me some other time? Tatsuya stared silently at the embarrassed seraph and once again confirmed that she had Ophis level of cuteness. He nodded his head and then moved his hand towards her, who immediately held it with a happy smile on her face. From some distance, Dulio, whose wallet had suffered a major blow, and Isami, who was now covered with a lot of accessories made by the locals here in heaven, were looking towards the forest that both Tatsuya and Gabriel entered a while back with a curious expression on their face. Don't you think that they have taken a lot of time there? And why did someone put a barrier at the entrance to block us from going there? Isami remained silent for a while, but then looked towards the forest with a serious look on her face and said, they must be having sex. Dulio, who heard that, looked towards the brown-haired girl with his eyes widened in shock, and then looked towards the forest with the same expression. He then formed a magic circle near his ear and called Michael. Hello, Michael-sama. Ah, yeah, everything is fine on our end, though we might have a small problem. It looks like both of them are indulging in indec. Forget that they are coming out now. He then saw both of them coming out with a smile on their faces and sighed in relief seeing that Gabriel had not fallen. Heh, that's exactly the smile one makes after having a wonderful fucking session. Hearing that, Dulio looked at her with a deadpan look on her face and said, you need some help in your mental department? But Isami didn't say anything and just showed him a middle finger without even liking towards him, making him twitch his lips. Both of them then looked around a bit more, and then Gabriel suggested to go and meet Michael since he would be happy to meet Tatsuya as well. Tatsuya nodded and Gabriel formed a magic circle below them, and soon both of them appeared in a huge building. Tatsuya then looked around and noticed that the building that they were in was big enough to house an entire army in there. This way, Tatsuya, said Gabriel, who started pulling him. Tatsuya silently followed the excited seraph, and soon both of them came in front of a room. Gabriel gave a knock on the door and then entered inside without waiting for any response. Seeing that Tatsuya wanted for a couple of seconds before he too entered the room. In there he saw Gabriel happily talking to her brother, telling him about how both of them spent the time together. Seeing that Tatsuya has entered the room, both of them looked towards him, and Michael bowed his head a bit, to which Tatsuya did the same. Long time no see, Michael. Yes, long time no see, sensei. I hope that you enjoyed your sightseeing here. Tatsuya smiled and said, yeah, my tour around here was very good and pleasant. I really liked it. Heading the praise, both the seraphs puffed their chests proudly. Michael then looked at Gabriel and asked, do you mind brewing us some tea? Gabriel shook her head with a smile on her face and said, not at all, brother Michael. Just wait, Tatsuya. I will make the tea very, very delicious. With a determined look on her face. Tatsuya chuckled seeing that and said, yeah, best of luck. Hearing which, Gabriel snorted and walked out of the room while sticking her tongue out towards Tatsuya. Once both him and Michael were there in the room, Michael immediately got into Jiza and started to apologize before following them. Needless to say, it was very tiring for Tatsuya to calm down his fan who was berating himself like that. Chapter 268. This time I know. Tatsuya was able to calm down Michael before Gabriel came back with tea and snacks. She then placed them on the table and served the two men who were sitting on the sofas. She too then took her seat beside Tatsuya and looked at him with an expectant gaze. Tatsuya, who noticed her, lifted his teacup and took a sip from it and nodded his head in satisfaction, seeing which Gabriel smiled happily and sipped on her tea as well. UWA, hot, 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 shouted Gabriel, who sipped in the hot tea a bit too hastily because of her excitement. Tatsuya then took out some water from his storage and made her drink it to calm the seraph down. Geez, you really are too energetic for your own good, you know? Gabriel gulped down the water and said, I am full of energy, you know, so it can't be helped. Tatsuya looked at the cheerfully smiling seraph and clicked her forehead, causing her groan in pain. Meanwhile, Michael used his magic to clean up the tea that was spilled by his sister and was happy to see her acting cheerfully with Tatsuya. Tatsuya then realized something and asked, what about Isami and Zenobia? Are their swords repaired? Michael immediately paced his cup down and with a sincere expression on his face said, don't worry, sensei. Their swords are still being repaired and currently both of them are in care of Griselda. You don't have to worry about anything. Tatsuya shook his hand and said, no, it is you who should be worried, and make sure to not let Isami on her own, or there might be a possibility of sudden rise in the population of fallen angels. The room turned totally silent as Michael stared at Tatsuya. Soon he formed a magic circle near his ear and said in a serious tone, Dulio, don't let the Red Dragon Empress out of your sight and make sure to not fall yourself. Gabriel then looked at Tatsuya and asked, Nana Tatsuya, how will the Red Dragon Empress increase the number of fallen angels? Is it one of her abilities? Tatsuya looked towards the curious seraph and shook his head and said, it's not her ability. It's the principle of her life. Her principles are so strong that the moment she would be turned to an angel using your brave Saint Carts, she would fall. Gabriel nodded, still looking a bit curious, and asked, but what will she do to make angels fall? Tatsuya thought for a while to explain her in a way so as to not corrupt her, and after thinking of an answer he decided to speak, but still used his magic to prevent her fall just in case. She will tell other about her fantasies, and those are way too effective against you angels. Gabriel once again nodded her head but was still curious as Tatsuya didn't specify it. She just shrugged her shoulders, not thinking much about it, since the only thing that she needed to know was that to keep the girl away from the angels when she is telling her fantasies. Tatsuya and the seraphs talked to each other for a while before the rest of the seraphs came in as well and started discussing matters regarding the Chaos Brigade and the Alliance. Tatsuya also warned them to be careful, as there might be a possibility for heaven to be attacked as well, since Underworld was attacked not too long ago, and such a thing might happen here as well. The other seraphs just nodded to his warning, except for Michael, who listened to him carefully, since the chances of something to happen were higher if Tatsuya was the one warning them, though it was a bit of his inner fanboy which made him hear to Tatsuya's words seriously. Soon the other two seraphs went back to do their work while Michael and Gabriel were still there, since they completed their work a bit earlier to not get interrupted when Tatsuya was there in heaven. Tatsuya looked at his watch and saw that a considerable amount of time has passed by and it was nearly night. Michel then looked at his own clock, which signifies the time there in heaven, and said, "It's pretty late. I will ask someone to prepare a meal right away." He then stared at the couple sitting in front of him and with a smile on his face said, "Sensei, why don't you two go and inform your companions about it? Might as well enjoy the night sky here in the heaven, which is a very beautiful sight if I say so myself." Gabriel nodded and stood up from her seat and stretched her body a bit. Sitting there for a long time and discussing about various things that were currently happening made her a bit tired, and she too was in the mood to get some fresh air. Meanwhile, Tatsuya just informed Isami with his telepathy, but still stood up from his seat and nodded his head. Gabriel then led him out of the huge building that they were in, and a sight even more majestic than the one he saw on the first heaven welcomed him. Tatsuya was once again amazed by how beautiful the heaven was made by the god of Bible, and took some points from here in order to maintain his own dimension. WHCH was currently used by Samuel and the other familiars from time to time. Even Tiamat used that dimension to keep some of her treasure since her cave was already full. Gabriel, who was beside him, glanced towards Tatsuya and smiled a bit, seeing him a bit excited on seeing the surroundings. She then started to think of the things that they did today, and felt happy that Tatsuya spent some time with her, since most of the people here in heaven were quite busy because of their low numbers, and her big status among the angels kept many of the angels to stay a bit away from her. She then slowly looked down towards Tatsuya's hands. She then looked away, trying to act distracted, and slowly moved her own hand towards Tatsuya's and slowly held it. Tatsuya, who felt his hand being grabbed by Gabriel, looked at her, and with a small smile on his face asked, "What happened?" Feeling happy, and gave her hands a light squeeze. Gabriel looked at him and nodded her head with a smile on her face and said, "Hey Tatsuya?" She then inched closer to him and gave a peck on his lips and said, "Thank you for today." Tatsuya, who received a sudden kiss from Gabriel, smiled as well and said, "You did the same thing back when we first met, remember?" Gabriel nodded her head and said, "Yeah, I remember. But this time I know that why the girl kissed the boy." And a slight blush appeared on her cheeks. "If you forgot, then it isn't 69 near the end?" Tatsuya, who heard her words, chuckled to himself, and after looking at her blushing cheeks for a while thought, "Looks like I was correct to use preventive measures to ensure that she do not fall." Tatsuya then pulled her towards him and returned gave a peck on her lips as well. Gabriel, who didn't expect that, looked away since she was feeling embarrassed by what he did, but still didn't let go of Tatsuya's hands and held it even tighter. Tatsuya looked at the seraph who was acting like that and patted her back and thought, "Really cute." Chapter 269. Treatment. Gabriel and Tatsuya stayed together with their hands being held by each other. Gabriel was feeling embarrassed and a blush on her cheeks and was finding it hard to start the conversation with Tatsuya. Tatsuya, on the other hand, was just smiling, looking at the surroundings and waiting for Gabriel to calm herself a bit. He had already understood what Michael's goal was and was not that surprised by Gabriel's sudden confession and just accepted it. He turned his head towards Gabriel, who was still embarrassed, and asked, "If you don't want to, then we can just stay here instead of going to have dinner with everyone, you know?" Gabriel remained silent for a while but soon gave a slight nod and said in a low voice, "You will stay with me, right?" and gripped his hand a bit tighter. Tatsuya just chuckled and pulled her in his embrace and said, "Of course," and then formed a barrier around himself to prevent others from coming near them. He then formed a bench and ST'd down on it along with Gabriel, who was totally red from being suddenly hugged by Tatsuya. She then looked up at Tatsuya, who was looking back at her with a small smile on his face, and then once again buried her head in his chest and said in a muffled tone, "Tatsuya." Tatsuya just caressed her back, in response to which Gabriel gave a slight nod. She then took a deep breath and said, "Aye," but was not able to finish her sentence. "Don't worry, Gabriel, just say it. I will wait for how much long you want to prepare yourself." Gabriel hugged Tatsuya even tighter on hearing his words and said, "Thank you." She then remained motionless for a few minutes with her face buried in Tatsuya's chest, who was busy patting her back while also storing away the information about the design of the heaven they were in, as he wanted to take some ideas from the place and modify his dimension accordingly. After a while, Gabriel suddenly looked up at Tatsuya's face and grabbed his face with her hands and made him look at her and said, "Titi Tatsuya I lilo." Gabriel, who was finally able to speak, but her tongue midway, and had a pained and embarrassed look on her face, and immediately hid her face with her hands. Tatsuya, who was suddenly pulled by Gabriel, chuckled seeing her acting like that, hearing which the embarrassed seraph started head-butting his chest intensely. Yeah, intensely. Her headbutts were literally making shockwaves, cracking the nearby floor. Tatsuya, who was chuckling while undergoing the cute headbutting session, hugged her tightly and said, "Don't be that embarrassed, Gabriel. Let me say it if you are not able to." Gabriel then stopped headbutting Tatsuya and waited in anticipation while still hiding her face with her hands. Tatsuya then pushed her out of his embrace and grabbed her hands which were hiding her face and looked directly at the blushing seraph and said, "I love you, Gabriel." Gabriel became motionless for a while, but soon her eyes widened in surprise and she started blinking them, after which an embarrassed expression appeared on her face, and with a nod she said, "I love you too, Tatsuya," and then looked at him with her slightly wet eyes. She then leaned in closer towards him, seeing which Tatsuya let go of her hand and cupped her cheeks which were totally red from embarrassment. Tatsuya then started to close in as well, seeing which Gabriel closed her eyes and soon felt something touching her lips. Gabriel, who for the first time felt being kissed, was a bit surprised and thought that it felt a bit different from the time when she was the one who initiated it. Tatsuya soon let go of her lips and said, "You know, Gabriel, you are not going to fall right now since I am making sure of it." She nodded her head with a slightly dazed expression, not fully understanding what Tatsuya meant. A mischievous smirk then appeared on Tatsuya's face as he caressed her lips with his fingers while using his other hand to support her already powerless body. Gabriel, who felt her lips being caressed by Tatsuya's fingers, wasn't sure what he was doing, but it somehow felt both nice and hot to her. Instinctively, she opened her mouth a bit and licked Tatsuya's finger, seeing which Tatsuya got slightly surprised since it somehow looked absolutely hot to him. The gap between their innocent and this state is just too much. He then once again placed his lips on top of hers and once again started kissing her, but this time instead of small and simple kiss, it was a passionate French kiss which took Gabriel by surprise, making her eyes widen in shock, only to melt into a pleasure a few moments later. She got so overwhelmed by the pleasure that at one point she was the one who started to take lead, surprising Tatsuya, who thought the saying that those who are innocent on the outside are usually wilder in the bed was true, I guess. Soon Gabriel stopped kissing Tatsuya and moved her head back, clearly showing the bridge of saliva connecting their tongues and the passionate yet confused look on her face. A magic circle then appeared in her hand, and immediately after that both of them got covered by a bright light and got teleported somewhere else. The next instant both of them appeared in some sort of room which from the looks of it was loudly saying to perform reproductive activities here. He looked at Gabriel with a questioning gaze which was totally ignored by the pleasure-struck seraph who pushed Tatsuya on the nearby bed. "I am feeling hot, Tatsuya. I don't know what is happening to me. Brother Michael told me that if I felt something like this when you were near me, then just teleport to this room and let Tatsuya treat me," said Gabriel while getting on the bed as well and walking towards Tatsuya on both her hand and knees. Seeing her like that, not even taking a moment, little Tatsuya woke up in full glory, threatening to rip off the pants that he was wearing while Tatsuya himself gulped his saliva, and the only thought that came to his mind was, "Looks like it is time to corrupt her innocence." He then flipped her body and now was on top of her and decided to start treating her. Chapter 270, Erosant, 18+. Gabriel, who was suddenly flipped by Tatsuya, was a bit surprised, but as soon as she gazed back at Tatsuya's eyes which were looking back at her, made the feeling hotter than before. She then instinctively moved her hand behind Tatsuya's neck and pulled him towards herself and started kissing him again, as this was the only thing that she knew to appease her hotness. Tatsuya too started kissing her back, but also started to massage her chest which were still covered by the soft cloth. Feeling the obstruction in his way, Tatsuya destroyed the clothes she was wearing, which was totally unnoticed by the seraph who was busy fighting against Tatsuya's tongue. Tatsuya then once again started fondling her chest, making Gabriel widen her eyes in surprise before she started moaning in pleasure. After the first moan came out, she immediately put her hand on top of her mouth, feeling embarrassed, but Tatsuya grabbed her hands and said, "Don't worry, Gabriel. You can moan as much as you want. There is no one here, and no one except for me will hear you. Plus those moans are hella erotic," thought Tatsuya. Gabriel then lowered her eyes a bit and said, "BB, but I will be embarrassed if you hear those kind of sounds." Tatsuya was faintly able to catch what she was saying as she was whispering in a very low tone. Tatsuya then caressed her cheek and said, "But I want to be the only one who will see that side of you. But if you don't want to, then that's fine as well. It's not like I am going to force you." Gabriel, who heard what Tatsuya said, looked back at him and found him looking at her with the usual caring smile that he always had for her. She smiled as well and took the hands which were holding hers and placed them on top of her chest and said, "Go on, I am ready. But please be gentle." She said the last parts with a slightly scared and embarrassed tone which somehow made Tatsuya motionless for a moment. He nodded his head approving to what Gabriel asked him and thought, "All right, slightly rough on her," and sat up and placed Gabriel on his lap and started fondling her boobs while also giving her nipples a pinch from time to time. Tatsuya, not this rough," moaned Gabriel, but all Tatsuya focused on was the moan and totally ignored the words that came along with it. He then saw Gabriel moving her hips a bit while sitting on his lap, possible feeling a bit irritated down there. He then moved one of his hand towards her crotch, which immediately shocked Gabriel, who tried to struggle her way out of Tatsuya's grasp, but Tatsuya too was famous for not letting his prey get away from him. "Should don't speak, just go with the flow. After all, I am treating you, so you have to do as I say." "Eh? I have to do as you say?" Tatsuya moved her head towards himself and placed his lips on top of hers and started sucking hers, to which she responded by sticking her tongue out. "You have to, or else I will have to be a bit mean and make you follow my lead." Hearing that, Gabriel trembled a bit and nodded her head cutely like a good child. Tatsuya smiled and patted her head and said, "Don't worry, I won't do mean things to you." "Probably." He then started to play with her crotch, much to Gabriel's surprise, who once again wanted to move his hand away, but stopped once she remembered that she have to follow Tatsuya's orders. She looked back at him with embarrassment and said, Tatsuya, don't touch me there, hhh. Tatsuya, who pinched her nipples in the middle of her saying something, earned a moan from her and asked, where should I not touch you, Gabriel-chan? Tell me, is it here, pinching her nipple, or here, pinching her clit? At both the times Gabriel gave out a pleasure-filled moan and looked at Tatsuya with some tears at the corner of her eyes and said, down there, at my vagina, don't touch me there. And her whole face turned red out of embarrassment. Tatsuya, seeing her acting like that, started wanting to tease her a bit more. He then placed her back on the bed and got on top of her and started to use some vibrations to pleasure the seraph even more. Gabriel, who received the sudden increase in pleasure, couldn't help but moan and look towards Tatsuya with slight anger and lust to make her feel like that. Tatsuya, seeing that, smirked and asked, sorry, Gabriel-chan, but your request has been denied, and once again started fiddling with her clit while also sucking on her breasts. Gabriel, who was now denied of her pussy being left alone, hugged Tatsuya's head tightly while asking him to not suck on her tits. Tatsuya, who felt that Gabriel was totally prepared, stopped fingering her and said, shall we start the main treatment, Gabriel? Oh, and this time you have choice. Gabriel, who was now totally flushed, looked at Tatsuya with her breathing slightly ragged and nodded her head. Tatsuya nodded his head as well and moved towards her legs and opened them widely to get a clear view of her pussy. Gabriel immediately tried to close her legs, but Tatsuya already stopped her from doing so using his telekinesis and said, now, Gabriel, don't be that hasty and let me have a good look, and clicked her clitoris, making her moan a bit. Once he was done inspecting her body positioned in a totally embarrassed position, Tatsuya took out his member, which was already erect thanks to the erotically innocent, iroscent seraph. Gabriel, who finally saw the huge thing between Tatsuya's legs, instinctively understood that it will enter inside her and felt a bit worried, thinking whether it will fit inside her or not. Tatsuya then positioned his dick in front of her pussy and rubbed it a bit, covering it in the juices that were coming out of her. He then looked towards Gabriel and asked, ready? Who nodded her head back, although with some hesitation. Tatsuya just gave a nod and then pierced her in one go without much problem, since he knew that the seraph was strong enough to not feel the pain from that. Though pleasure was a different thing, as Gabriel's back arched upward in response, seeing which Tatsuya hugged her and made her sit in his lap and started moving without asking for her consent. Gabriel, who was moaning continuously, started to move her hips on her own. Tatsuya, who noticed that, stopped moving and let her do the work while he started to enjoy her boobs and ass, adding much to Gabriel's pleasure, making her moans louder and louder. After having some fun with her, Tatsuya once again laid her back on the bed and whispered in her ears, let's get serious now, shall we? And started thrusting once again, much to Gabriel's shock, as this time Tatsuya was actually trying to thrust a bit harder, only using his strength to the point that she could take. Aha, harder, Tatsuya, harder. Do me harder, said the totally heated up Gabriel, busy giving both herself and Tatsuya some pleasure. Tatsuya was a bit surprised by her sudden change and thought, looks like she awakened, just like Asia. Tatsuya, who felt that he was close to blowing up, looked Gabriel and was about to ask something. Something is coming out, Tatsuya. What should I do? Tatsuya gripped her waist a bit tighter and said, let it come out, and started thrusting even faster. The unexpected sudden barrage of attacks from Tatsuya left her speechless and eyes rolled back a bit. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. H, said Gabriel, who gave a moan and arched back a bit. Me too. Ack, said Tatsuya, who came inside her and laid back on the bed and embraced the seraph who was lying beside him. He then poked her cheek a bit, wanting to tell her to sleep, but all of a sudden his body was rolled over, and it was now Gabriel on top of him with lust and love evident in her eyes. Oh well, looks like it is going to be a long night, thought Tatsuya, ready to take on the seraph. 3 days later, the door of the room they have been in opened, and a happy-looking Gabriel came out with Tatsuya with her hands wrapped around his. Tatsuya, who was looking up towards the sky, thought, innocent girls are way too wild. Chapter 271. Sword Fight. Tatsuya and Gabriel then decided to go and meet the other two girls who came with him, and was surprised to see Isami and Zenovia being trained by Griselda, who had a smile on her face. He also noticed that both of their swords were repaired and improved, and were sparring against each other, though there was a difference between the expressions of the two girls. While Zenovia had a troubled look on her face and was drenched in sweat, Isami, on the other hand, was simply playing with her opponent with a relaxed smile on her face. Drake, isn't this peaceful? I couldn't agree more to that statement, partner.
No overpowered strict trainers.
No old grudge-bearing hags. No training till dropping dead. This is the life. Yeah, this is the life. The Longinus and its holder were having a pleasant conversation with each other while having their fight against Zenovia. Griselda, on the other hand, had an appreciative look, seeing that both the girls were quite capable. Zenovia, who had her ex-Durandal in one hand and Excalibur Destruction in the other, was attacking Isami without any break, and feeling frustrated since she was not able to land a solid hit on her, and if not for the barriers surrounding them, the shockwaves created by her attacks could have damaged a major part of the heaven they were in. Tatsuya and Gabriel wailed towards Griselda, who was looking at the fight, but once she noticed the two of them, she bowed her head and greeted them. Gabriel just waved her hand and was now back to her usual self. Thought Tatsuya still decided to create some fail-safes, just in case her switch gets flipped and she accidentally falls down. Being cucked by Azazel was the last thing Tatsuya wanted after all. So, what are the two of them doing for the past 3 days? Asked Tatsuya, looking towards the woman wearing the nun outfit. The two of them were waiting for you to return, but when the two of you didn't show any signs of coming, I decided to train them in the meantime since their swords were repaired as well. But I have to say the Red Dragon Empress does have a skill with the sword. Haha, well it certainly took a lot of effort to teach her from scratch, but still the results were good, said Tatsuya, remembering the days he taught her cough, trained Isami, who had tears of sorrow, happiness coming out on being trained by him. Hearing that, Griselda looked at Tatsuya, looked at his body intently, and once she was done checking him out, she nodded her head and said, "You must be quite a good swordsman yourself, seeing that your form is very complex to deal with as well." Tatsuya then noticed that Zenovia started to prepare for a big attack and started charging her energy in her two swords, making the entire field inside the barrier tremble under the pressure of her power. Meanwhile, Isami just had a serious look on her face as she focused on the swords in Zenovia's hands and started to charge up energy in her sword as well. "Want my help, partner?" "No need, Drake. I alone would be enough." "I think so, since that amount of holy energy is indeed sending creeps in my spine." She then raised her sword as well, and her sword started to shine as well, and started to get covered in flames. Outside the barrier, the three people who were looking at the fight were now wearing sunglasses while staring at them, and Tatsuya asked, "Who do you think will win this clash?" Even though the Red Dragon Empress is capable, the fact that both Durandal and Excalibur are better compared to her Ascalon puts her at a disadvantage in this, and seeing how this is going on, I think this is going to be a head-on competition between their powers. Zenovia. Then, I will bet on my student. Gabriel just stood silent and looked at the two girls, and thought that it has been a while since she fought someone with her full capabilities, but just shrugged her shoulders, not thinking much about it. She didn't like fighting in the first place and will only fight when it is necessary. "Ex-Durandal!" shouted Zenovia while slashing her Ex-Durandal M filled with energy towards Isami, firing and devastating beam from her sword. "We are shouting names, huh?" Then, inhale, Ascalon, and fired the red energy beam along with her Dragon Slayer flames towards the incoming attack. Seeing the intensity of the attacks, Gabriel just raised her hand and formed a stronger barrier along the already existing one since it would easily break by the attacks. Tatsuya and the other two could hear the shattering sound of the barrier while the clash of the two attacks made huge shock waves and the area around them became intensely hot because of the flames.
Boom.
Soon a huge explosion occurred inside the barrier, destroying the entire area without any exception, but the barrier was still able to hold it in. Soon the smoke and dust started to die down, and an Isam came into view with her hand which was holding the sword slightly trembling and bleeding. On the other hand, in place of Zenovia, a circular dome stood there which soon disappeared and transformed into a sword and was held by Zenovia, who immediately used her other charged sword and fired another attack towards Isami. "Let's see how you take my Excalibur destruction head on." "Hold up, you used the mimic sword to form a protective dome around you. That's hella unfair," protested Isami with annoyance. But Zenovia ignored her and threw her Ex-Durandal away and just took out another Excalibur fragment from it. The instant she took out the new sword, she vanished from her spot and appeared behind Isami, who for the first time from the beginning used her gauntlet to block the slash coming towards her. Now the rapid version. "Zenovia, that's unfair." "Indeed it is. So what? Take this," and slashed her destruction sword towards Isami, who immediately transformed into her balance breaker and caught the sword. Boost. Drake started boosting, trying to push back the attack from Excalibur destruction, but before they were able to finish the clash, the barrier around them broke and Tatsuya said, "Alright, match over. Zenovia wins." "The hell with it, Isami. It was a sword fight, not a brawl." "Tatsuya, don't stop me. She was the one who used unfair tactics," shouted Isami, now transformed back to her usual form while pointing a finger towards Zenovia, who was already lying on the ground taking deep breaths. Just because you were not able to predict an outcome made it unfair. Looks like you need more training. I will make some time in my schedule for you." Isami immediately fell on her knees as tears started to come out of her eyes. She was about to say something before she saw Tatsuya smiling towards her and just hung her head down, knowing that there was no escape now. She then looked at her gauntlet and said, "Looks like happiness does not last forever. Indeed, that's how life is. My condolences to you, partner," said the dragon inside the sacred gear. Chapter 272. Back from Heaven. "You mean to say that you and Gabriel-san went on and on for 3 days straight?" asked a surprised Isami while looking towards Tatsuya. She then looked towards the girl in question and stared at her for a while and said, "Damn." Tatsuya looked at Isami from the corner of his eyes and said, "Isami, we are in a public place, in heaven at that. Make sure to mind your tongue, alright? We don't want Azazel to have more fallen angels." Tatsuya, who had already made a barrier around them to prevent Isami's Nalid from reaching the angel's side as he looked at the girl in question. Isami in turn just nodded her head in approval and after a while started muttering, "I will try to do a 4-day straight then. Gotta build up my stamina for that. Looks like it's time to focus in the Taimatsan's class. I will ask Kurumi-san as well." Tatsuya and Griselda just looked at the Red Dragon Empress with a deadpan look on their faces, while Zenovia seemed to be noting something down in a notepad. Gabriel, who was elegantly drinking tea, encouraged Isami to do her best. Both of them then sighed and Griselda looked towards Tatsuya and asked, "Are both of them always like that?" and pointed towards Isami and Zenovia. Tatsuya looked back at her and said, "That's not even their final form, you know?" Hearing that, Griselda widened her eyes in surprise and looked towards the two girls. Tatsuya, who was done with his tea, looked towards Isami and Zenovia and said, "Let's get going then. Your swords are repaired, and you don't want to face a pissed of Sona for skipping school like this, right?" Hearing that, both the girls frowned a bit, as they knew how strict Sona could be regarding these matters. "Aren't you going to be in trouble as well? Not to mention that it is your fault that we are still here," said Isami, pointing her finger towards Tatsuya. "Nah, I am not in trouble since my grades are not bad at all, and even if Sona decides to approach me regarding skipping school, well, let's just say we will have a heated discussion to settle things in between us." Both Isami and Zenovia twitched their lips at that, but soon kept that at the back of their mind and prepared to leave. All of them notified about their departure to Michael, and then Tatsuya made a magic circle leading back to Kuo and teleported away along with the other two. But just as they teleported, Tatsuya felt that something was off and soon found the reason for that once he noticed that he teleported outside of Kuo. Tatsuya and the girls looked at each other with surprised look on their faces as Tatsuya immediately searched what was happening. He then took a step forward and knocked his fist on something that seemed to be like a transparent wall. A barrier surrounding the whole town. Huh. Looks like someone wants to get their ass kicked. Very badly at that. Tatsuya then made a hole in the barrier and went inside along with the other two and said, "Hey Isami, will you do an errand for me?" But instead of replying, Isami changed to her balance breaker and said, "Deal with the mob that are deploying the barrier, right?"
No problemo.
Zenovia took out her sword as well and said, "I will lend her a hand as well." Tatsuya nodded his head, and then telepathically sent them the location where the people were, and the two immediately left to do their job. Once they were gone, Tatsuya looked in front and took out his guns and started flying towards the school while also killing any guest he found on his way. Once he reached the school, Tatsuya was met with a huge army of mages guarding the building, and immediately Tatsuya said, "Ah, this feels nostalgic." There was a similar situation during the peace summit of the three factions. Hearing his voice, all of the mages looked towards Tatsuya, but just as they turned their heads, Tatsuya used his telekinesis to crush their skull and said, "I did the same back then as well." He then walked inside the school, saw a huge dome inside which many students were lying unconscious while the devils were busy doing something, most probably brainwashing the children. Tatsuya then got inside the barrier as well, and once all of them noticed his presence, they sighed in relief, and Roswise said, "I will fill you up on the situation." Tatsuya, who had already read their minds, just shrugged his shoulders and let her do what she wanted. "Sure, go ahead, but before that." Tatsuya looked towards the children whose bodies were floating in the air because of his telekinesis and changed their memories accordingly and sent them back to their classes, while still being unconscious. Tatsuya looked at the others who were still there and said, "Check the school grounds to search for more intruders, and some of you go and check the town as well. I cleared the people that came in my path, but there are still quite a few that are left." All of them nodded as the student council members started to check the school grounds, while the Nekashu from Tatsuya's team decided to check the town. So let's get this straight. A huge army of magicians suddenly appeared in the town out of nowhere, but were instantly destroyed by Miyuki, after which a few moments later, an army of dragons came and you all started to engage with them, while another group of magicians appeared after the dragons and got in the town because of the distraction. Various stuff happened. You all dealt with the dragons somehow, or some of them managed to escape. Then you all dealt with magicians that were threatening the students, and during all this commotion, Kaneko, Ravel, and Miyuki get kidnapped by them. Hearing his explanation, Roswise, Sona, and the others who were still there nodded their heads. Tatsuya remained silent for a while and then sighed and said, "Well, I pity that person who kidnapped Kaneko, and Ravel kidnapped Miyuki by mistake as well. He must be dead by now." Well, knowing Miyuki, she would not do something dangerous, except for when asked by you or it is something related to you. But still, that person's blood must have been frozen by now. Tatsuya looked at his teammates who were talking to each other, but then Tatsuya noticed that the barrier started shattering and now knew that Isami and Zenovia were done with their job. Just as he thought that, Isami and Zenovia came back with some prisoners in tow to interrogate them. "But why did you take so long to come back? You should have been back 2 days ago, right?" asked a curious Roswise. But before Tatsuya could say anything, Isami said, "He was busy fucking a seraph. For 3 days straight. Not our fault, just so you know." Tatsuya, who was now the center of attention, decided to change the topic and said, "Well, let's get Miyuki and the other two back." And then opened a portal. Once he stepped inside the portal, he found himself in a very big space and started looking around. And just as he was looking, image around his eyes fell on something that made them widen in surprise. "Tell me, dragon, who is a disgrace and a piece of shit and should just persish from the face of earth?" "Ah, it's me, mistress. I Grendel is the one who is a disgrace and piece of shit, Mistress Kurumi." What Tatsuya saw was a huge 9-tailed fox stepping on top of a black-scaled dragon with his whole body covered in wounds and his face being crushed by the fox's foot. "What the hell was happening here?" asked Tatsuya, but none was there to answer him. Chapter 273, Frozen. Tatsuya looked at the dragon who was being dominated by Kurumi and then towards the 9-tailed fox. He then turned his head to the side and asked, "Was it really necessary to let your clone do that and show this to everyone?" On his side, Kurumi in her human form was standing and looked towards Tatsuya and said, "I mean, I won't do something like that personally, you know. Though it's a different thing if you want to do that. Even if I decided to do that, which I am pretty sure that I won't, I would be the dominant one anyway, and couldn't you have just put the dragon under a genjutsu?" Kurumi blinked her eyes in surprise, and then looked towards her fox-transformed clone who was looking towards them and nodded her head. The huge fox nodded its head as well as a purplish-black ball started to form in its mouth. Seeing that, Tatsuya immediately formed a barrier around the huge creatures, and soon the whole barrier got covered in an explosion. Once the explosion died down, the fox disappeared in a cloud, and the dragon was left motionless with a serious wound in his chest, and was now put in an illusion by the fox that just disappeared. Tatsuya then bound the dragon up and then looked towards Kurumi and asked, "So, what are you doing here?" Oh, Ruya told me about the invasion and that some idiot was trying to kidnap some of us, so I just came here to deal with the situation. After all, it is my responsibility as their eldest sister to make sure that they are safe. Not to mention that you were exceeded your stay in heaven, so it basically became my job anyway. Kurumi then shrugged her shoulders and asked, "By the way, what made you extend your stay?" Tatsuya looked at Kurumi and said, "Gabriel confessed to me. Things got heated up. Gabriel got even more heated up, went on with her for 3 days straight. That's the gist of it." Kurumi blinked in surprise for a while and then said, "Innocent ones are really dangerous. Asia was like that as well, but still nowhere close to our record 19 days 7 hours and 23 minutes stay, right? I am not going to ask how do you know the exact time, but still, yeah, one of the best uses for the time chamber," said Tatsuya with a satisfied look on his face and nodded his head. He then looked around and asked, "Anyway, where are Miyuki and the others?" "Oh well, where there is cold there is Miyuki," and started to look for an area covered in ice. Soon enough he found the place and saw Miyuki and the other 2 girls who were kidnapped sitting around a table with a cup of tea in front of them and the whole area covered in ice. Both Kaneko and Ravel were looking awkwardly at the cup and then at each other, not knowing what the hell was happening here. Miyuki then felt the presences coming towards them and said, "Oni-sama, want to join us for some tea?" With a beautiful smile on her face which was even complemented by the beautiful ice around them. "I am here too, you know," said Kurumi, who was walking beside Tatsuya. "Oh, Kurumi. Sorry you were not visible since you got outshined by Oni-sama's radiance. Anyway, do join us." And took out 2 cups of tea from her storage and placed them on the table for Tatsuya and Kurumi. Tatsuya and Kurumi took their cups and drank their tea quietly while sitting with the rest of them as well. Tatsuya then looked at Ravel and Kaneko and asked, "You two are fine, right?" Kaneko and Ravel nodded their heads, no longer feeling awkward as they decided to not think much about it. Tatsuya nodded and said, "It's fine then." It seems like the one they were after was Ravel, since they wanted the phoenix tears from an original phoenix to improve their artificially created ones. Hearing that, all of them looked towards Ravel as she felt guilty thinking that it was her fault for getting everyone in danger. Tatsuya, who heard her thoughts, teleported her in his lap, much to her surprise as she immediately became embarrassed bad. Her cheeks turned red. "TT Tatsuya-sama? Is something the matter, Ravel?" asked Tatsuya with a smile on his face.
Wuwuwucha.
"Oh, I just remembered. Thanks for the cakes that you baked for me that time. They were really delicious." Is that so? I am glad that you liked them," said Ravel, giving a relieved sigh. But soon her eyes widened and she said, "Wait, that's not the matter here," said Ravel, looking towards Tatsuya with a slightly angered expression. But Tatsuya ignored her words as he started patting the head of blonde girl sitting in his lap, making Ravel's face immediately turn beet red out of embarrassment, making her look down in shame. On the side, Kaneko, who saw all that, had already broken the table near her, with just clutching the edge of the table between her hands. "Calm down, Kaneko. Tatsuya-senpai is just doing that to calm down Ravel. Yeah, senpai has no ill intentions. Let the phoenix enjoy right now, since she might be thinking that she dragged everyone in danger." Kurumi, who felt the emotions coming out of Kaneko, patted her back, and to calm her down a bit. Kaneko looked towards Kurumi, who was patting her back, and just sighed and controlled herself a bit. Ravel, on the other hand, was totally embarrassed by Tatsuya's actions, who slowly started to whisper some things near her ear and tried to make her not blame herself for the incident. Tatsuya then looked towards Miyuki and asked, "By the way, where's the one that kidnapped you three?" Miyuki placed her cup down and soon the ice beside her started to crack up as a big box made up of ice emerged from the ground. Inside the box was a frozen Euclid Lucifuge with a panicked look on his face and his hands covering his crotch. Miyuki looked at Tatsuya with a smile on her face and said, "This **king piece of shit said something along the lines that he wanted to let Oni-sama know how he felt by ravaging your sister aka me. Well, let's just say, I made sure to freeze him beyond the borderline of life and death, since not only he is Graphius-san's brother, but also there was a possibility that he might get revived by that sacred gear, right?" Tatsuya nodded and patted Miyuki's head and said, "Good job, Miyuki. I am proud of you." Miyuki nodded with a bright smile on her face on being patted by Tatsuya. "By the way, isn't this letting him off the hook too easily?" asked Tatsuya with a friendly smile on his face. Miyuki nodded with an equally friendly smile on her face and said, Don't worry. I took all the precautions necessary. His muscles are totally frozen, so he will not even be able to move. I was just waiting to confirm things with you since he is Graphia's brother." Tatsuya smiled and said, "No need to hold back, Miyuki. We can just bring him back to life if he, unfortunately, dies. So do as you please." Miyuki just nodded her head with a radiant smile, and a similar smile was present on Tatsuya's face as well, which made the two siblings even more attractive than they already were. Though the other people who were sitting with the siblings had a deadpan look on their faces, as they with their mouths open wide, not knowing how could they talk like that with such a smile on their faces. Chapter 274, Sibling Reunion. Later that day, Tatsuya's team, along with the other devil peerages, were busy fixing the town and were helped by Azazel. Tatsuya, on the other hand, decided to deal with his dear brother-in-law and called Graphia to come to his house, while also explaining the situation to the other Sisk, Devil Kings. Though he kept the matter about Euclid up to himself, as he wanted to let Graphia have a talk with him first. Tatsuya-sama, it's good to see you again, said Graphia while bowing her head and wearing her usual maid attire. Tatsuya sighed and said, haven't I told you that you can be informal to me when we are alone? I feel comfortable this way, though if you really want then I will change it. No need, I am fine as long as you are comfortable, and the maid play in the bed is the absolute best, said Tatsuya and nodded his head sagely. Hearing that, Graphia blushed a bit, but still smiled towards Tatsuya and asked, by the way, what was the thing that you want to discuss with me? Tatsuya didn't say anything, and just gestured her to follow him. Both of them then went to the basement, and then Tatsuya said, just a warning, but be prepared for a surprise. Graphia nodded her head and said, knowing what kind of person you and the others are, I am always prepared for one whenever I meet you all, and looked back towards him with a resolute expression on her face. Was that a praise or an insult? Anyway, let me show you whom we caught during this attack. He then opened the door of a room and Graphia saw that the whole room was covered in ice. Both of them then entered the room and Graphia saw a huge ice block standing in the middle of the room. Tatsuya, who saw that the contents inside the block were not clearly visible, used his magic to make the contents clear for him and Graphia. What Graphia saw made her widen her eyes in shock. In front of her, a man stood trapped inside a block of ice having the same hair and eyes as her, and she easily recognized him as her brother who was thought to be dead during the Civil War. Though for some reason her brother had a panicked look on his face and his hands were covering his crotch. Tatsuya, with the shocked look on Graphia's face, patted her shoulder and said, he is alive and kicking. In fact, he was the one who led the attack. Though he pissed Miyuki off and the result is in front of you. He is only alive because Miyuki knew that he was your brother and that you might want to clear some things between you two. Graphia, who was totally shocked by what she saw and heard, remained silent for a while and started to arrange her thoughts. Once she was done, she took a deep breath and looked towards Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who saw her looking at him, nodded and said, I will stay here as well. This fucker might try to play the emotional blackmail card on her. Tatsuya then melted the ice around the devil and made a barrier around him to prevent him from getting away and started to heat him up a bit so as to increase his body's temperature. Once his temperature returned to normal, Tatsuya, forceful, woke him up using his psychic power and then motioned Graphia to continue. Tatsuya made chairs for both him and Graphia, and both of them sat in front of the devil, who was trapped inside a barrier. Euclid, who was forcefully woken up, clutched his head in pain and after a while was able to think normally. He then started looking around to check where he was, but stopped once he found her sister sitting in front of her, along with the black-haired fucker of his brother-in-law, who looked at him with a smile and waved his hand. Hello, good to see you, brother-in-law. How have you been? Euclid glared at Tatsuya for a while, but then looked towards his sister, who was looking at him with some complex emotions containing feelings of anger, concern, anger, happiness, anger, relief, anger, and a lot more. Seeing the face of his sister, who he only saw from the screen which he used to stall cough, cough, keep watch of intruders, made him feel a bit happy, though his face remained neutral like it originally was. Unfortunately for him, Tatsuya could see what the hell that brain of his was thinking, and he made sure that he will put him in a 3-way war genjutsu for a whole year, and will add a maid cosplay for him as special for him being his brother-in-law. Nice to see you, Euclid, said Graphia in an indifferent tone. Well, I would like to say it is nice to see you, Ne-sama. Though my situation is not allowing me to say so. Graphia just raised her finger as a magic circle appeared in front of it, and a chair made up of ice appeared behind Euclid. Seeing the chair, Euclid smiled and said, as expected of Ne-sama, she cannot see me suffering, and sat down. But just as he sat down, his whole body was covered in ice restraints, seeing which Euclid got shocked and looked towards Graphia, who was apathetically looking at him. Now, then, do you want to start the story yourself, or you want some convincing? And you better not waste our time, Euclid. We have a lot to deal with because of your this stupid little act. Tatsuya, who saw the siblings looking back at each other, secretly placed a diarrhea curse on Euclid, who was currently restrained and was sitting in front of the person he liked. Now this is gonna be fun, thought Tatsuya. Bas he saw Euclid's complete emotionless face starting to show some slight and unnoticeable expressions. He then looked towards Graphia, who still haven't caught on to Euclid's situation, and just took some distance from them, telling to let both of them have a bit of privacy, and took out some popcorn from his storage and started watching the show. Chapter 275. You stay here. The sight which was in front of Tatsuya was something he was never going to forget. Seeing Euclid trying so hard to not let the expressions come out on his face in front of Graphia was a sight to behold. The thoughts that could only be said a total mess were there in his head, and Tatsuya was quite amused by listening to his thoughts. Though the number of times the little brother thought about doing something with his sister, Tatsuya would improve the effects of the curse a bit, much to Euclid's dismay. Graphia, who was hardly able to get answers out of her brother's mouth, was starting to get pissed at him, and thought it would be better to use other means to get the information out of him. Euclid, I am asking for the final time, will you tell us where your so-called master is, and what is he planning? I told you already, even if you were my older sister, I am still not going to give any information to a traitor like you. Even though you are looking at me so passionately and I love you so shit. Why again is this happening? It's taking all my willpower to let me emotions not appear on my face, you know. Which sho? No, let's not think about that. Concentrate, Euclid. You cannot let sister is in front of you. What would she think if she knew what is happening to me right now? Grafia, I think you should use some other means to get the info out of him. You can hit him as hard as you want, don't worry about killing him. We have Asia, and if that is still not enough, I am here as well, right? Said Tatsuya as he stood beside Grafia and placed his hands on her shoulders. That stinking human piece of bug, shit, how dare you get close to Mine-sama. Get the hell away from he dash, Though Euclid as he wanted to clutch his stomach, but was not able to because of his hands being restrained in ice. Grafia looked towards Tatsuya, who was looking at her with a soft smile, and was about to say something, but Tatsuya interrupted her and asked, or I can do it as well. Or more like, please let me do it, I cannot have you hit your brother. It will not sit well with you, right? Don't worry, I won't hit him as well. Grafia widened her eyes in surprise and was hesitating a bit. She knew that it was important to get the information out of Euclid's mouth, but was still not able to bring herself to ruthlessly hurt her brother. She knew that if Tatsuya said that he will not hurt her brother, then there must be a way to do that, but still she felt like she would be asking too much from him. Tatsuya, who knew what she was thinking, pecked her cheek and said, Don't worry, Grafia. I am asking you to let me do it, not the other way around, right? And besides, it was my territory and sister that were kidnapped by him, so I have the right to interrogate him as well, Grafia, who was kissed by Tatsuya, would usually not think much about it and just enjoy that, but right now being in front of her brother, she felt a bit embarrassed and had a slight blush on her cheeks. Tatsuya-sama, don't do that here. Euclid is watching us. It's embarrassing. Hearing that, Tatsuya smirked and whispered in her ears, Then you mean that you don't have a problem with me doing whatever I want with you when no one is watching us, right? And slightly bit her earlobe. The gray-haired maid felt a shiver run down her spine and felt both excited and embarrassed hearing that, and with a slight blush on her cheeks looked away and just gave a slight nod. Seeing her acting like that, Tatsuya chuckled and started teasing her once again as he felt that his maid acting all shy and embarrassed was quite cute and wanted to see more of that. Meanwhile, the other person except for the couple that were currently flirting has his eyes wide open with anger evident in them, and once could also see that there was some blood dripping near his fists, which were clenched tightly. Euclid Lucifuge was looking at his sister flirting with the despicable piece of human shit and had bloodshot eyes and was seething with rage. He wanted to just separate those two and tear apart the human who was so close to his sister by was being restrained. Get the hell away from my Grafia, nay, sama you fu asterisk her. And how dare you kiss her beautiful cheeks with that filthy mouth of yours? Let me tell you, sama used to kiss me as well, when we were kids. She even used to bath along with me, when we were kids. Heck, she even promised me that she will become my bride, and that's the reason she still haven't married yet. This didn't happen at all. I will kill you. I will kill you. Tatsuya, who had currently stopped listening to his thoughts because he already expected that it would just be something useless, continued to flirt with Grafia for a while, who was so embarrassed and excited that she was willing to get pushed down then and there if her brother wasn't present. Tatsuya too was willing to abide by her thoughts and looked at his watch and thought, the others will still take some time to come back, okay? He then looked towards Euclid and said, you stay here and don't make a ruckus, and secretly increased the effectiveness of the curse for all the bullshit he may have thought when Tatsuya wasn't listening to his thoughts. He then carried Grafia in a princess carry and teleported from the room, leaving the silver-haired Lucifuge, whose thoughts were in a total chaos, alone there.